Helping others feels like the right thing to do. It makes you feel kind, needed, and respected. But when helping becomes a habit instead of a choice, it starts to cost you more than you realize. Your time, your energy, your self-respect, and slowly, without noticing, you begin to disappear behind everyone else's needs. Most people who overgive don't do it because they're weak. They do it because they're afraid of disappointing others, afraid of being seen as selfish, or afraid of losing connection. But constant helping teaches people to rely on you without respecting you. And the more you give without boundaries, the less your effort is valued. This audiobook is about understanding the hidden psychology of overgiving, about learning when helping turns into self-neglect, and how to reclaim your time, your energy, and your worth without guilt. Because helping others should never require sacrificing yourself. Chapter 1. Why helping feels like the right thing to do. Helping feels right because it speaks to something ancient inside the human heart. Long before modern society, survival depended on cooperation, care, and shared effort. Philosophy reminds us that belonging has always been tied to usefulness. To help meant to matter. To be needed meant to be safe. That instinct never disappeared. It simply changed form. Today, helping others still activates a deep sense of purpose. It tells us we are good, valuable, and worthy of connection. When someone thanks us or relies on us, the mind translates that dependence into meaning. In a world that often feels chaotic and indifferent, helping becomes a way to anchor identity. It answers the quiet question, "Why am I here?" with immediate emotional relief. This is why helping feels noble, even when it costs us. The act itself produces warmth, a temporary certainty that we are doing something right. But what begins as meaning can slowly turn into obligation if never examined. Helping also feels right because it aligns with how many of us were taught to earn love. From a young age, approval often followed compliance, usefulness, and sacrifice. Philosophy calls this conditional belonging. You were praised when you were helpful, quiet, accommodating, or selfless. Over time, the mind learns an equation: care equals acceptance. This lesson becomes internalized so deeply that helping stops being a choice and becomes a reflex. You help not because you freely want to, but because not helping triggers anxiety. The discomfort of saying no feels heavier than the cost of saying yes. In this way, helping becomes emotional self-protection. It shields you from guilt, rejection, and the fear of being seen as selfish. The problem is not kindness itself, but the belief that kindness is the price of belonging. When helping is used to secure love, it slowly erodes freedom. There is also a powerful identity hidden inside helping. To help is to feel competent. To be relied on is to feel strong. Philosophy recognizes this as the ego's subtle reward. When others depend on you, you feel significant. You become the fixer, the supporter, the one who holds everything together. This role can feel empowering, especially if other areas of life feel uncertain. Helping becomes a way to stabilize self-worth externally. Each request fulfilled becomes proof of value. But this value is fragile because it depends on constant giving. The moment you stop helping, the identity feels threatened. Fear enters. Fear of becoming irrelevant, fear of being forgotten. What once felt like strength quietly turns into pressure. You are no longer choosing to help. You are maintaining an image of yourself that cannot rest. Helping also feels right because it temporarily silences inner conflict. When you are focused on others' problems, you avoid facing your own. Philosophy has long observed that outward devotion can be a form of inner escape. Helping gives direction to restless energy. It fills emotional space that might otherwise be occupied by uncertainty, loneliness, or unresolved pain. When you help, you feel busy, useful, and morally aligned. There is little time left to ask difficult questions about your own needs. This is why overgivers often feel uncomfortable with stillness. Stillness brings awareness. Awareness brings truth. Helping becomes a way to postpone that encounter. As long as you are needed, you do not have to sit with yourself. What feels virtuous may also be avoidance wearing a noble mask. Another reason helping feels right is social reinforcement. Society praises selflessness loudly and questions self-protection quietly. Philosophy warns that moral praise can be deceptive when it ignores balance. Helpers are often admired publicly while being depleted privately. You are called kind, generous, reliable labels that feel affirming. But these labels come with expectations. Once assigned, you are expected to live up to them indefinitely. The role solidifies. People stop asking whether you can help and start assuming that you will. Helping feels right because it keeps you aligned with how others see you. Breaking that alignment risks disappointment. The fear of disappointing others can be stronger than the fear of losing yourself, at least at first. Helping also activates empathy, one of the most powerful human capacities. When you see someone struggle, your nervous system mirrors their pain. Philosophy teaches that empathy without boundaries becomes absorption. You begin to feel responsible for easing discomfort that is not yours to carry. Helping feels right because it relieves that mirrored pain. Saying no feels cruel, even when it is necessary. This emotional merging makes it difficult to distinguish compassion from obligation. True compassion recognizes suffering without consuming itself in it. Overhelping blurs that line. You help not because it is wise, but because the discomfort of not helping feels unbearable. This is empathy untethered from self-respect. There is also a spiritual dimension to helping that complicates it further. Many traditions praise service as a path to virtue. Philosophy acknowledges this truth but adds a condition: service must be conscious. Unconscious service becomes self-erasure. When helping is done without awareness of cost, it stops being sacred and becomes transactional. You give hoping for peace, but peace never arrives because the giving is fueled by fear rather than choice. The spirit grows tired. Resentment quietly replaces joy. Yet the habit continues because the idea of stopping feels like betrayal of one's values. Helping feels right because it is wrapped in moral language, even when it is harming you. Helping feels right because it creates immediate clarity. You know what to do. Someone needs something, and you provide it. Life feels simple in that moment. Philosophy notes that clarity is comforting. Complexity is avoided, but long-term clarity requires reflection, not reaction. When helping becomes automatic, reflection disappears. You stop asking whether the help is sustainable, appropriate, or healthy. You only ask whether it is needed. Need becomes the only criteria. This is dangerous because need is endless. There will always be someone who needs more. Without boundaries, helping becomes a bottomless demand on your life. Another reason helping feels right is that it postpones conflict. Saying yes avoids difficult conversations. It keeps harmony on the surface. Philosophy reminds us that peace without truth is temporary. Over time, unspoken limits turn into inattention. The body carries what the voice does not express. Fatigue grows. Irritation leaks. Relationships become heavier. Helping once prevented conflict. Now it creates it internally. But by the time this is noticed, the pattern feels too established to break easily. Helping has become part of who you are, not just what you do. Helping also feels right because it offers control in an uncertain world. You may not control outcomes, other people, or life's direction, but you can control your response. You can give. Philosophy recognizes giving as a way to assert agency. But when giving becomes compulsive, control becomes illusion. You are no longer choosing, you are reacting. True agency includes the ability to withhold, to pause, to discern. Without that, helping becomes another form of being controlled by expectation, by fear, by habit. There is also grief hidden beneath constant helping, grief for unmet needs, grief for support you never received. Philosophy observes that people often give what they longed for themselves. Helping feels right because it is an attempt to heal an old absence indirectly, but giving does not replace receiving. Without learning to receive care and honor your own needs, the cycle never completes. You keep giving from an empty place, hoping fullness will appear. It does not. Ultimately, helping feels like the right thing to do because it touches goodness, empathy, belonging, and meaning. But philosophy teaches that anything done without awareness can turn against you. Helping is not the problem. Unexamined helping is. When you begin to understand why helping feels so necessary, you regain choice. And with choice, helping can return to what it was meant to be, an expression of strength, not a substitute for self-worth. Chapter 2. When kindness turns into self-neglect. Kindness turns into self-neglect the moment it stops being a choice and becomes a reflex. Philosophy teaches that virtue loses its purity when it is driven by fear instead of awareness. At first, kindness feels expansive. You help because you care, because it aligns with your values, because it feels human. But slowly, the motive shifts. You begin helping to avoid discomfort, guilt, or conflict. In that shift, something subtle breaks. You stop asking whether you have the capacity to give. You only ask whether someone else needs you. Your inner voice grows quieter as external demands grow louder. Self-neglect does not arrive dramatically. It enters gently, disguised as goodness. You praise yourself for endurance, for patience, for sacrifice, not realizing that sacrifice without consent is erosion. The world sees generosity. You feel depletion. This is the first sign that kindness has crossed a dangerous line. Self-neglect often begins with ignoring small signals. Fatigue, irritation, quiet resentment, these are early warnings. Philosophy reminds us that the body speaks when the soul is ignored. Instead of listening, overkindness teaches you to override these signals. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. You push through exhaustion. You minimize your own discomfort because someone else has it worse. This comparison silences legitimate needs. Over time, the habit of self-dismissal becomes automatic. You stop checking in with yourself at all. Needs feel inconvenient. Rest feels undeserved. Boundaries feel selfish. This internal conditioning slowly disconnects you from your own experience. When kindness requires constant self-denial, it stops nourishing anyone, including the people you help. Kindness becomes self-neglect when your identity depends on being useful. Philosophy calls this conditional self-worth. You begin to measure your value by how much you give, how much you endure, how much you fix. When usefulness becomes identity, rest feels like failure. Saying no feels like betrayal. You fear that without your help, you will become invisible. This fear traps you in endless giving. The tragedy is that the more you give to be valued, the less you feel valuable on your own. You are admired for what you provide, not for who you are. Over time, this distinction becomes painful. You are present everywhere, yet absent from yourself. Self-neglect also appears when kindness overrides honesty. You soften truths to protect others' feelings while ignoring your own. Philosophy warns that suppressed truth turns inward as tension. You smile while disagreeing. You agree while feeling resistance. You support decisions that hurt you. Each time you choose harmony over honesty, you fracture your integrity slightly. These fractures accumulate. Eventually, your kindness feels hollow because it is no longer aligned with truth. People sense this misalignment even if they cannot name it. Relationships become strained not because you are unkind, but because your kindness is no longer authentic. Authenticity requires self-respect. Without it, kindness becomes performance. Another sign of kindness turning into self-neglect is chronic overextension. You say yes without checking your limits. Philosophy emphasizes moderation as wisdom. When moderation disappears, imbalance follows. Overextended kindness drains physical energy, emotional resilience, and mental clarity. You become tired, but you keep going. You become irritated, but you suppress it. You become empty, but you keep giving. This pattern creates burnout disguised as virtue. Burnout is not weakness, it is prolonged self-abandonment. When kindness ignores capacity, it turns destructive. You cannot pour endlessly without consequence. The cost is paid quietly in health, joy, and identity. Kindness turns into self-neglect when you stop receiving. Philosophy recognizes reciprocity as essential to balance. When you give constantly but struggle to accept support, you create inequality. You become the giver, never the human in need. This role feels noble but isolating. You listen but are not heard. You support but are not supported. Over time, loneliness grows beneath generosity. People assume you are strong, capable, and fine. You reinforce this image by never asking for help. Self-neglect thrives in this silence. Without receiving, giving loses its grounding. Compassion without reciprocity becomes martyrdom. There is also a moral pressure that fuels self-neglect. Society praises sacrifice loudly and questions self-care quietly. Philosophy cautions against confusing morality with self-harm. When you are rewarded for overgiving, the behavior intensifies. You become proud of exhaustion. You wear depletion as proof of goodness. But goodness that destroys the giver is unsustainable. True virtue supports life, not drains it. When kindness demands the erasure of your needs, it contradicts its own purpose. A burned-out helper cannot offer presence, only obligation. Self-neglect deepens when kindness replaces boundaries. Boundaries are often misunderstood as barriers, but philosophy defines them as containers. Without containers, energy leaks. When you help without limits, people learn to expect without asking. Gratitude fades, assumption grows. You feel taken for granted, yet struggle to speak up because kindness has become your identity. Resentment builds quietly. Resentment is a signal that a boundary was needed but never set. Ignoring that signal is self-neglect disguised as patience. Kindness becomes self-neglect when you fear being less kind more than being whole. You prioritize others' comfort over your well-being. Philosophy teaches that fear distorts virtue. Fear-driven kindness is not free, it is compulsive. You help even when it harms you because the alternative feels emotionally dangerous. This fear keeps you trapped. You confuse self-protection with selfishness. In reality, self-protection is what allows kindness to remain genuine. Without it, kindness becomes obligation, and obligation breeds bitterness. Another turning point occurs when kindness prevents growth yours and others. Philosophy notes that constant rescuing interferes with learning. When you always step in, others do not develop resilience. When you always adapt, you do not evolve. Growth requires discomfort. Overkindness removes that discomfort artificially. You sacrifice your growth to preserve others' ease. Over time, stagnation sets in. You feel stuck, unseen, and unfulfilled. This stagnation is not fate, it is the cost of misplaced kindness. Self-neglect also shows up as emotional suppression. You avoid expressing anger, disappointment, or fatigue because they conflict with the image of being kind. Philosophy warns that suppressed emotion does not disappear, it transforms. It becomes anxiety, numbness, or quiet rage. These emotions leak out indirectly, damaging relationships. Kindness that forbids honesty poisons connection. Healthy kindness allows truth to coexist with care. Without that balance, the inner world suffers. There is grief inside self-neglect, grief for the self that never received the care it offered so freely. Philosophy observes that many overgivers are compensating for unmet needs. You give what you wished you had received, but giving cannot replace receiving. Until you acknowledge your own needs, kindness will continue draining rather than nourishing. Grief must be faced, not bypassed through service. Kindness turns into self-neglect when identity shrinks around one role, the helper. Philosophy teaches that a single role cannot hold a whole human life. You are more than support, more than sacrifice, more than availability. When you forget this, your life becomes narrow. Joy fades, curiosity dies, identity weakens. Self-neglect thrives where identity is limited. Another sign is guilt when resting. Rest feels earned only after exhaustion. Philosophy rejects this bargain. Rest is not a reward, it is a requirement. When kindness teaches you to earn rest through suffering, it turns cruel. A rested person helps with presence. An exhausted one helps with resentment. The difference is felt by everyone involved. Ultimately, kindness turns into self-neglect when it is no longer guided by awareness, choice, and self-respect. Philosophy reminds us that virtue must include the self to remain virtuous. When you restore balance, kindness becomes sustainable again. You help because you want to, not because you fear what will happen if you don't. And in that freedom, kindness regains its power without costing you your life. Chapter 3. The Psychology of Overgiving. Overgiving is not a personality trait. It is a psychological pattern shaped by experience, fear, and conditioning. Philosophy teaches that behavior repeated under emotional pressure becomes identity. Many overgivers did not wake up one day deciding to neglect themselves. They learned slowly that giving created safety, approval followed helpfulness, connection followed sacrifice. Over time, the mind associated giving with survival. This association is powerful because it operates below awareness. Overgiving feels natural, even moral, because it is tied to early emotional rewards. When you help, anxiety softens. When you say no, discomfort rises. The brain remembers this contrast and chooses relief over truth. Psychology calls this negative reinforcement. You give not to gain something, but to avoid something painful. This is where overgiving begins, not in kindness, but in fear quietly shaping behavior. At the core of overgiving is the fear of abandonment. Philosophy recognizes abandonment fear as one of the deepest human anxieties. When connection once felt conditional, the nervous system learns to maintain bonds through effort. Overgivers often believe unconsciously that love must be earned repeatedly. Resting feels risky. Pulling back feels dangerous. Helping becomes proof of loyalty and worth. This belief does not fade with age, it adapts. Adult relationships replace childhood ones, but the pattern remains. You give more than is asked. You anticipate needs. You overextend. All to prevent the imagined moment when someone decides you are no longer necessary. The tragedy is that this fear-driven giving often produces the very outcome it tries to avoid: invisibility and emotional distance. Overgiving is also linked to poor boundary development. Psychology shows that boundaries are learned through modeling. When boundaries were inconsistent, ignored, or punished early in life, the adult self struggles to form them. Philosophy describes this as a confusion between love and limitlessness. Overgivers equate boundaries with rejection. They believe that protecting themselves means hurting others. This false belief traps them in endless availability. Without boundaries, giving loses shape. It spills everywhere. People stop recognizing its value because it never stops. What is always available is rarely appreciated. The overgiver feels unseen and confused, not realizing that boundaries are what allow generosity to be perceived clearly. Another psychological driver of overgiving is identity fusion. Helping becomes who you are, not what you do. Philosophy warns against reducing the self to a single role. When identity fuses with usefulness, self-worth becomes fragile. Any moment of rest feels like failure. Any refusal feels like betrayal. Overgivers often say, "If I don't help, who am I?" This question reveals the core wound. The self has been replaced by function. Function can be exploited. A self with boundaries cannot. Overgiving persists because letting go feels like losing oneself entirely. The fear is not of stopping, but of disappearing. Overgiving is reinforced by social praise. Society applauds sacrifice without questioning its cost. Psychology calls this external validation conditioning. When exhaustion is praised, the behavior strengthens. You learn that depletion equals virtue. Philosophy challenges this narrative by asking whether goodness that destroys the giver can truly be good. Overgivers rarely receive concern. They receive admiration. This admiration becomes addictive. It fills emotional gaps temporarily, but admiration does not nourish. It does not restore. It only demands repetition. Over time, the helper becomes trapped by the image of being strong, reliable, and selfless. Asking for help threatens that image, so needs remain unspoken. The cycle tightens. Another psychological factor is conflict avoidance. Overgivers often associate disagreement with danger. Philosophy notes that when early conflict felt unsafe, the adult self avoids it at all costs. Helping becomes a strategy to maintain peace. Saying yes avoids tension. Saying no risks rupture. The nervous system chooses the path of least resistance. Over time, peace is preserved externally while war grows internally. Resentment accumulates, exhaustion deepens. Yet the pattern continues because the fear of conflict outweighs the pain of self-neglect. Overgiving becomes emotional anesthesia, numbing discomfort at the cost of vitality. Overgiving also satisfies a desire for control. Helping creates the illusion of influence in an unpredictable world. Philosophy recognizes this as compensatory agency. When you cannot control outcomes, you control effort. You give more, you do more, you stay useful. This creates a sense of purpose, but it is fragile. The moment you stop giving, the illusion collapses. True agency includes the ability to withdraw, to rest, to choose. Overgiving replaces agency with compulsion. You are no longer directing your life. You are reacting to demand. Another psychological layer is unresolved guilt. Overgivers often carry guilt for simply existing, resting, or having needs. Philosophy calls this existential guilt. Helping becomes atonement. You give to justify your presence. You feel worthy only when useful. This guilt is rarely conscious, but it drives behavior relentlessly. Until guilt is questioned, overgiving feels necessary. The mind whispers, "If you stop, you are selfish." This inner accusation keeps the pattern alive. Overgiving is also linked to emotional over-identification. You feel others' pain intensely and assume responsibility for relieving it. Psychology calls this emotional fusion. Philosophy warns that compassion without separation becomes self-destruction. Feeling with someone does not require carrying them. Overgivers confuse empathy with obligation. They absorb what is not theirs. Over time, emotional fatigue sets in. The helper becomes empty, numb, or irritable. Yet stopping feels cruel. This internal conflict drains energy constantly. Another factor is delayed self-attention. Overgivers believe they will care for themselves later. Philosophy calls this deferred selfhood. Life becomes a waiting room where your needs are always postponed. Later never arrives because demand never ends. The self fades into the background. Overgiving thrives where self-attention is endlessly delayed. Recovery begins when attention returns inward without guilt. Overgiving is sustained by hope for reciprocity that never comes. You give expecting understanding, appreciation, or care in return. When it does not arrive, disappointment grows. Philosophy teaches that unspoken expectations create silent suffering. Overgivers rarely express needs clearly because doing so feels selfish. Instead, they give more, hoping effort will be noticed. This hope keeps the cycle alive. When reciprocity fails, bitterness emerges. Another psychological root is fear of self-definition. Overgivers avoid asking, "What do I want?" because the answer might require change. Philosophy notes that clarity demands courage. It disrupts patterns. Overgiving keeps life predictable. Predictability feels safe, even when painful. Breaking the pattern requires tolerating uncertainty. Ultimately, the psychology of overgiving reveals a paradox. The desire to help comes from goodness, but the compulsion to help comes from fear. Philosophy teaches that freedom lies in choice. When giving becomes chosen rather than automatic, it regains its beauty. Until then, overgiving is not generosity. It is self-abandonment asking to be seen. Chapter 4. Why people start taking you for granted. People start taking you for granted not because they are suddenly unkind, but because behavior teaches expectation. Philosophy reminds us that humans adapt quickly to patterns. When help, availability, and sacrifice are constant, the mind stops registering them as effort. What was once appreciated becomes assumed. Gratitude fades when something feels guaranteed. Overgivers unintentionally create this guarantee by always showing up, always fixing, always saying yes. At first, people notice. Over time, they stop, not out of cruelty, but conditioning. The brain conserves attention by ignoring what feels permanent. When your presence becomes permanent access, its value drops quietly. This is how being taken for granted begins not with disrespect, but with predictability, without boundaries. One reason people take you for granted is that you remove consequences from your generosity. Philosophy teaches that value requires contrast. When help is offered regardless of cost, urgency disappears. Others no longer feel the weight of your effort because they never experience its absence. Absence creates appreciation. Presence without limit creates expectation. When you continue giving even when tired, busy, or hurt, people assume you are fine. Your silence about cost communicates comfort. Comfort invites dependency. Dependency replaces gratitude. You feel unseen, but your behavior has taught others that seeing you is unnecessary for access. Another factor is the way overgiving removes accountability from others. When you step in before someone struggles, you prevent them from feeling responsibility. Philosophy notes that responsibility creates respect. Without it, reliance turns passive. People begin to wait rather than act. Waiting breeds entitlement. Entitlement erodes appreciation. You may feel helpful, but you are also removing opportunities for others to value your effort. When people do not carry weight, they do not recognize weight. Your constant support shields them from consequence, and in doing so, diminishes their awareness of what you provide. People also take you for granted when your boundaries are unclear or inconsistent. Philosophy emphasizes clarity as the foundation of respect. When limits shift or disappear, others test unconsciously. Testing is not malicious. It is exploratory. If no resistance appears, the test becomes habit. Habit becomes expectation. Expectation becomes entitlement. When you finally express fatigue or frustration, people feel surprised, even offended. They believed the pattern was mutual agreement. Your silence was interpreted as consent. This misunderstanding is painful, but it reveals an important truth. Boundaries spoken late are often received as unfair. Another reason lies in emotional labor being invisible. Philosophy teaches that what is unseen is undervalued. Emotional support, listening, anticipating needs these efforts leave no physical trace. When you provide emotional stability quietly, others forget it required effort. You become the emotional infrastructure of the relationship, unnoticed unless missing. Infrastructure is essential, but rarely praised. When people rely on your emotional presence without acknowledging it, gratitude fades. You feel drained, not because you gave, but because your giving was unseen. Unseen effort rarely receives respect. People begin taking you for granted when you avoid expressing dissatisfaction. Philosophy warns that unspoken truth distorts relationships. When you suppress frustration to preserve harmony, others assume all is well. Assumptions guide behavior. They increase demands. You absorb more while appearing calm. Over time, this imbalance becomes normalized. When you finally speak up, people feel blindsided. They did not ignore your needs. They never knew them. Silence protected peace temporarily, but destroyed clarity. Without clarity, appreciation cannot survive. Another cause is role fixation. When you are always the helper, others stop seeing you as a full person. Philosophy cautions against identity narrowing. Roles simplify relationships, but reduce depth. When you become the reliable one, your complexity disappears. Your needs feel incompatible with your role. Others unconsciously resist seeing them. They prefer the version of you that serves. This is not intentional cruelty. It is convenience. Convenience often erases empathy. When empathy fades, appreciation follows. People also take you for granted when you give more than you ask for. Philosophy teaches that reciprocity sustains balance. When exchange becomes one-sided, imbalance forms. Others adjust to the imbalance without guilt because it was never challenged. You train them to receive without offering. This pattern feels normal to them and unfair to you. Resentment grows quietly. Resentment poisons generosity, but the root was not their failure to give. It was your failure to ask. Another reason is emotional availability without limits. When you are always accessible, people stop checking timing. They interrupt, demand, and assume availability. Philosophy notes that time protected gains value. Time unprotected loses it. When you treat your time as endlessly flexible, others mirror that belief. They do not see boundaries to respect. You feel invaded, but they feel entitled. This mismatch breeds frustration. Respect cannot grow where time has no visible value. People also take you for granted when you solve problems before they are felt. Philosophy reminds us that struggle creates appreciation. When you intervene early, others never experience difficulty. Without difficulty, relief has no contrast. Relief without contrast feels ordinary. Your help becomes invisible. You remove pain before it registers, and in doing so, remove gratitude as well. Over time, you feel like you are doing everything, yet nothing seems to matter. Another contributing factor is fear of disappointing others. When you never allow disappointment, you teach others that your limits are negotiable. Philosophy teaches that disappointment is part of honesty. Avoiding it at all costs creates false harmony. False harmony collapses into silent resentment. Others sense tension but do not know why. They respond by distancing or demanding more. Appreciation cannot survive in confusion. People begin taking you for granted when kindness is divorced from self-respect. Philosophy insists that generosity must include dignity. When dignity is absent, generosity feels cheap. Not because it lacks value, but because it lacks boundary. Boundaries give generosity shape. Shape gives value. Value invites respect. Without shape, generosity dissolves into background noise. Another reason is delayed self-assertion. When you wait too long to speak up, patterns solidify. Philosophy teaches that habits resist change. When you finally express needs, others struggle to adjust. They are not malicious, they are conditioned. This resistance feels like rejection, but it is inertia. The longer imbalance lasts, the harder correction becomes. People also take you for granted when you internalize blame. You assume others' behavior reflects your inadequacy rather than learned patterns. Philosophy warns that misplaced blame deepens self-neglect. You give more to compensate, reinforcing the cycle. The more you give, the more you are expected to give. Expectation replaces appreciation completely. Ultimately, people take you for granted when your giving lacks boundaries, visibility, and reciprocity. Not because they are bad, but because human psychology adapts to patterns. When you change the pattern, perception shifts. Respect returns where clarity appears. Appreciation grows where limits exist. And generosity regains meaning when it is chosen, not assumed. Chapter 5. Helping as a way to seek approval. Helping becomes a way to seek approval when kindness is tied to worth instead of choice. Philosophy teaches that when love feels conditional, behavior becomes performative. Many people learn early that being helpful earns praise, safety, or acceptance. Over time, the mind internalizes a belief: to be valued, I must be useful. This belief does not announce itself. It guides quietly. You help not because the situation calls for it, but because approval feels at stake. Each yes becomes a bid for reassurance. Each sacrifice becomes proof of goodness. The danger is subtle. Approval feels like connection, but it is unstable. It depends on continued performance. When helping becomes a way to secure validation, the self is placed on probation. You must keep giving to remain worthy. This turns generosity into labor and kindness into currency. The moment approval becomes the goal, helping loses its freedom and becomes a transaction paid with your energy. Approval-seeking helping often begins with fear of disconnection. Philosophy recognizes disconnection as a primal threat. When relationships once felt fragile, the adult self learns to stabilize them through effort. Helping becomes emotional glue. You anticipate needs, fix problems, and overextend to prevent distance. This pattern is not conscious manipulation, it is survival strategy. The nervous system relaxes when others are pleased. Anxiety spikes when others are disappointed. To avoid that spike, you give more. Over time, the body associates approval with safety. Saying no feels dangerous. Rest feels irresponsible. The helper becomes trapped in a loop where peace depends on pleasing others. What feels like love is actually relief. Relief fades quickly, requiring repeated giving. The cost accumulates silently. Helping to seek approval also distorts self-perception. Philosophy teaches that identity shaped by external response becomes unstable. When your sense of self rises and falls with praise, you lose internal grounding. You begin to monitor reactions closely. You adjust behavior to maintain favor. This vigilance drains presence. Others sense the performance beneath the kindness. Paradoxically, approval-seeking weakens respect. People trust those who act from conviction, not those who seek permission through service. When helping is motivated by approval, it feels anxious rather than generous. Anxiety communicates need. Need invites control or dismissal, not admiration. Another consequence of approval-driven helping is emotional dependency. You begin to rely on gratitude, recognition, or relief from others to feel okay. Philosophy warns that dependency erodes autonomy. Autonomy is the foundation of dignity. Without dignity, helping feels hollow. You give, but the satisfaction is short-lived. You need another task, another request, another opportunity to be useful. This creates exhaustion disguised as virtue. The helper becomes indispensable to others while becoming disposable to themselves. Over time, resentment grows because the approval never fully nourishes. It was never meant to. Approval-seeking also narrows kindness into selectivity. You help those whose approval matters most. Philosophy observes that when virtue becomes strategic, it loses universality. You may neglect your own needs or those of people who cannot offer validation. Helping becomes uneven. This imbalance creates inner conflict. You sense that your kindness is not entirely free. Guilt appears, not for helping, but for the motive behind it. Yet stopping feels risky. The fear of losing approval outweighs the discomfort of misalignment. This inner tension is the psychological toll of approval-driven helping. Helping to gain approval often suppresses honesty. Philosophy emphasizes truth as the backbone of ethical action. When approval is prioritized, truth is softened or withheld. You avoid saying what might disappoint. You agree when you disagree. You offer help even when it costs too much. Over time, suppressed truth turns inward as fatigue and irritability. Relationships feel safe on the surface, but unstable underneath. Others sense the strain without understanding it. They respond by demanding more or distancing themselves. Approval becomes harder to maintain, intensifying the cycle. Another feature of approval seeking is overfunctioning. You do more than is asked to ensure appreciation. Philosophy notes that overfunctioning removes responsibility from others. When you carry excess weight, others carry less. This imbalance breeds entitlement. Entitlement erodes gratitude. You give more to regain approval, but approval decreases because effort is now expected. The helper feels invisible. The attempt to secure validation produces the opposite outcome. This paradox is painful because the original intention was connection. Approval-driven helping also interferes with growth. Philosophy teaches that growth requires boundaries and discomfort. When you constantly accommodate, you avoid the discomfort of asserting needs. Others avoid the discomfort of self-reliance. Both parties stagnate. The helper remains busy but unfulfilled. The relationship remains active but shallow. Approval replaces intimacy. Intimacy requires truth and mutuality. Approval requires performance. Performance exhausts. Intimacy nourishes. Another psychological cost is self-alienation. When your actions are guided by others' reactions, you lose contact with your own desires. Philosophy calls this loss of self-authorship. You become a character written by expectations. Helping continues, but joy disappears. You feel useful, but not alive. This numbness is often mistaken for maturity. In reality, it is the absence of self. Approval-seeking keeps you occupied, so you do not notice the loss immediately. Helping to seek approval also creates fear of rest. Rest removes opportunities to earn praise. Philosophy warns that when worth depends on effort, stillness feels threatening. You stay busy to avoid confronting emptiness. But emptiness is not absence. It is space waiting for self-definition. Without rest, you cannot hear your own needs. Without hearing them, you cannot honor them. Approval becomes louder than intuition. Another effect is difficulty receiving help. Philosophy teaches reciprocity as balance. Approval seekers struggle to receive because receiving does not prove worth. It feels passive. Giving feels active. This imbalance isolates you. You become the helper who never needs help. Others stop offering. Loneliness grows beneath usefulness. The approval you sought replaces connection, not completes it. Approval seeking also distorts compassion. You help not from empathy, but from fear of rejection. Philosophy distinguishes love from attachment. Attachment clings to outcomes. Love respects freedom. When helping is attached to approval, it pressures others to respond positively. This pressure subtly poisons generosity. Others feel obligated rather than grateful. Obligation erodes appreciation. Breaking this pattern requires questioning a core belief that approval equals safety. Philosophy invites a deeper truth. Safety grows from self-trust. When you trust your worth independent of usefulness, helping becomes lighter. You choose when to give and when to rest. Choice restores dignity. Dignity restores respect. Respect replaces approval as the foundation of connection. Ultimately, helping as a way to seek approval is kindness turned inward as fear. When fear is released, kindness becomes free again. You help because you want to, not because you need to be liked. In that freedom, helping regains its joy, and approval becomes irrelevant rather than required. Chapter 6. How Overgiving Destroys Self-Respect. Overgiving destroys self-respect, not all at once, but through a series of quiet betrayals against the self. Philosophy teaches that self-respect is built through alignment between inner truth and outward action. Each time you give when you mean no, that alignment cracks. You may justify it as kindness, patience, or generosity, but the body records it differently. It registers the moment you ignored your own limit. Over time, these moments accumulate. You begin to feel smaller inside, less solid, less certain. Self-respect erodes not because you are giving, but because you are giving against yourself. The world may praise your generosity, but internally something weakens. You stop trusting your own voice. And when you no longer trust yourself, others sense it too. Self-respect requires the ability to protect one's own needs without apology. Overgiving removes that protection. Philosophy warns that when boundaries dissolve, identity follows. Each unnecessary sacrifice teaches your mind that your needs are optional. Optional needs become ignored needs. Ignored needs become resentment. Resentment poisons generosity from within. You continue helping, but the warmth is gone. What remains is obligation. Obligation does not strengthen self-respect. It undermines it. You feel trapped by your own kindness, resentful of the very people you wanted to support. This internal contradiction damages your sense of integrity. Integrity is the backbone of self-respect. Without it, you feel hollow even when surrounded by appreciation. Overgiving also trains you to associate worth with exhaustion. Philosophy rejects this association. Worth is inherent, effort is conditional. When you only feel valuable after sacrificing yourself, self-respect becomes transactional. You respect yourself only when you are depleted. Rest feels undeserved. Saying no feels like failure. This mindset turns life into a test you must constantly pass. Self-respect cannot survive in such conditions. It requires rest, reflection, and self-approval that is not earned through suffering. When exhaustion becomes proof of goodness, self-respect collapses under the weight of constant effort. Another way overgiving destroys self-respect is by silencing anger. Philosophy views anger as information, not a flaw. Anger signals violation of boundaries or unmet needs. Overgivers suppress anger to maintain harmony. Suppressed anger does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes self-criticism, shame, and quiet self-contempt. You begin blaming yourself for feeling tired, frustrated, or unseen. This self-blame corrodes self-respect. Instead of questioning the pattern of overgiving, you question your worth. The problem was never your feelings, it was your refusal to honor them. Overgiving also distorts how you see yourself in relationships. Philosophy teaches that respect is relational and internal. When you consistently place others' needs above your own, you position yourself as secondary. This hierarchy becomes internalized. You stop seeing yourself as an equal participant. Equality is essential for self-respect. Without it, you become invisible to yourself. You define your role as support, not as a full human being with needs and limits. This role-based identity is fragile. The moment you cannot help, you feel worthless. Self-respect cannot survive when identity depends solely on usefulness. Another destructive effect of overgiving is the loss of agency. Philosophy defines agency as the capacity to choose freely. Overgiving replaces choice with compulsion. You help because you feel you must, not because you want to. Compulsion erodes dignity. Dignity is the emotional experience of self-respect. When your actions are driven by fear, guilt, or expectation, dignity fades. You feel controlled by circumstances rather than guided by values. This loss of agency weakens confidence. Without confidence, self-respect struggles to stand. Overgiving also teaches you to ignore intuition. Philosophy values intuition as inner wisdom. When intuition signals exhaustion or resistance and you override it repeatedly, you weaken trust in yourself. Self-respect depends on self-trust. Each ignored signal is a message that your inner guidance does not matter. Over time, intuition grows quiet. You feel disconnected from yourself. Disconnection breeds self-doubt. Self-doubt erodes self-respect. You begin looking outward for direction and validation because your inner compass has been dismissed too often. Another way self-respect is damaged is through unreciprocated effort. Philosophy emphasizes balance as a principle of life. When giving is one-sided, imbalance forms. You give more, receive less, and tell yourself it is fine. But the psyche notices. You feel undervalued, even if no one explicitly devalues you. That feeling settles inward as diminished self-worth. You may blame others for not appreciating you, but the deeper wound comes from not valuing yourself enough to stop. Self-respect requires willingness to withdraw when balance is absent. Overgiving refuses that withdrawal. Overgiving also creates internal conflict between who you are and who you present. Philosophy teaches that authenticity is essential for psychological health. When you present as endlessly capable and willing while feeling depleted inside, you live a double life. This split drains energy and undermines self-respect. You know you are not being honest, even if the dishonesty is framed as kindness. Living against your truth weakens your sense of self. Self-respect cannot coexist with self-betrayal. Another subtle erosion occurs when overgiving prevents growth. Philosophy views growth as movement toward wholeness. When all your energy goes outward, there is little left for development. You neglect your dreams, interests, and inner life. Over time, you feel stagnant. Stagnation breeds dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction turns inward as self-criticism. You blame yourself for feeling unfulfilled while continuing the behavior that causes it. This cycle erodes self-respect deeply. Overgiving also distorts the meaning of love. Philosophy distinguishes love from sacrifice without consent. When love requires constant self-erasure, it becomes destructive. You begin associating closeness with depletion. This association damages your relationship with yourself. Self-respect requires the belief that you deserve care, not just that you can provide it. When love only flows outward, the self dries up. Another effect is chronic guilt. Overgivers feel guilty when resting, setting boundaries, or prioritizing themselves. Philosophy identifies guilt as misplaced responsibility. You feel responsible for others' emotions and outcomes. This burden is unsustainable. Carrying it convinces you that your needs are burdensome. Believing your needs are burdensome is a direct attack on self-respect. Overgiving also teaches others how to treat you, and when that treatment lacks respect, you internalize it. Philosophy reminds us that external treatment influences internal perception. When you tolerate disregard, interruption, or assumption, you slowly accept that you deserve it. This acceptance becomes self-concept. Self-respect fades not because others disrespected you, but because you allowed it to continue. Finally, overgiving destroys self-respect because it replaces self-love with self-sacrifice. Philosophy teaches that self-love is not indulgence, it is responsibility to one's own life. Without self-love, generosity becomes harmful. Self-respect returns when giving is chosen, not demanded. When you begin honoring your limits, listening to your needs, and acting in alignment with your truth, self-respect rebuilds. Slowly, quietly, but firmly. Self-respect continues to erode when overgiving becomes your default response to discomfort. Philosophy teaches that discomfort is not an enemy, it is information. When you rush to help others the moment discomfort appears, you avoid listening to what that discomfort is asking of you. Often, it is asking for rest, honesty, or distance. Overgiving numbs that signal. Each time you override discomfort with sacrifice, you reinforce the belief that your inner experience is less important than external harmony. This belief settles deeply. You begin distrusting your own reactions, assuming they are excessive or selfish. Self-respect cannot survive where self-doubt replaces self-trust. When your instinct is always to give rather than to reflect, you lose the ability to honor your internal boundaries. Over time, you stop feeling entitled to them at all. Overgiving also damages self-respect by trapping you in a cycle of emotional debt. Philosophy warns that when you give with the unconscious hope of being valued, you create silent expectations. These expectations remain unspoken but emotionally charged. When they are not met, disappointment turns inward. You blame yourself for feeling unappreciated instead of questioning the imbalance. This self-blame chips away at self-respect. You begin to feel foolish for wanting reciprocity. You label your needs as weakness. In doing so, you abandon yourself emotionally. Self-respect requires acknowledging desire without shame. Overgiving teaches you to deny desire and call it virtue. This mislabeling corrodes dignity quietly but persistently. Another layer of destruction comes from the loss of self-prioritization. Philosophy emphasizes that priority reveals value. When everything else comes first, the self is relegated to last place. This ordering becomes internalized. You stop seeing your goals, health, and dreams as legitimate priorities. They feel optional, indulgent, or unrealistic. Over time, this deprioritization creates a sense of insignificance. You may appear central to everyone else's life while feeling peripheral in your own. That disconnect is devastating to self-respect. You exist everywhere except at the center of your own decisions. Overgiving also weakens self-respect through chronic self-interruption. You interrupt rest to help. You interrupt focus to respond. You interrupt personal growth to meet external needs. Philosophy teaches that interruption fragments identity. A fragmented self struggles to maintain dignity. You feel scattered, unfinished, and reactive. Self-respect thrives on continuity, the ability to stay with yourself long enough to know who you are becoming. Overgiving disrupts that continuity. You are constantly pulled outward, leaving no space for inner consolidation. Without consolidation, confidence fades. Without confidence, self-respect struggles to breathe. Another subtle damage occurs when overgiving trains you to accept imbalance as normal. Philosophy warns that normalization shapes belief. When imbalance persists, you stop noticing it. You adapt. Adaptation without awareness becomes resignation. You resign yourself to being the one who gives more, waits longer, and asks less. This resignation feels mature on the surface, but internally it feels diminishing. Self-respect cannot grow in resignation. It requires agency. Agency disappears when imbalance is accepted as fate rather than pattern. Overgiving also distorts how you measure success. Philosophy teaches that success aligned with self-respect includes well-being, growth, and authenticity. Overgivers measure success by usefulness. Did I help enough? Did I do enough? Did I carry enough? These metrics ignore inner health. You may succeed outwardly while failing inwardly. This split creates cognitive dissonance. You feel accomplished yet empty. The emptiness is often misinterpreted as ingratitude or weakness. In reality, it is the absence of self-respect asking to be restored. Another way overgiving destroys self-respect is through emotional invisibility. Philosophy holds that being seen is a basic human need. Overgivers often ensure everyone else is seen while remaining unseen themselves. They listen deeply, but are not listened to. They support fully, but are not supported. Over time, invisibility becomes internalized. You stop expecting recognition. You stop believing your inner world deserves attention. Self-respect fades where visibility is denied repeatedly. Overgiving also creates fear of stopping. Philosophy teaches that fear reveals attachment. When you fear setting boundaries because you believe everything will collapse without you, you assign yourself exaggerated responsibility. This belief is exhausting and unrealistic. Carrying it makes you feel powerful and powerless at the same time. Powerful because you feel needed, powerless because you feel trapped. This contradiction destabilizes self-respect. True self-respect allows you to step back without catastrophe. Overgiving convinces you that rest equals abandonment. Another deep erosion occurs when overgiving disconnects you from joy. Philosophy views joy as a signal of alignment. When life becomes duty-driven, joy fades. You may still help, but the lightness is gone. Helping feels heavy. This heaviness spreads into other areas of life. You feel old emotionally, even when young physically. Self-respect cannot thrive in joylessness. It requires moments of aliveness. Overgiving postpones aliveness indefinitely. Overgiving also undermines self-respect by creating emotional inequality. Philosophy teaches that equality is not sameness, but mutual recognition. When one person always gives and another always receives, equality disappears. You may excuse it as generosity, but internally you feel diminished. This feeling erodes dignity. Dignity is central to self-respect. Without it, you feel small even when praised. Another effect is chronic indecision about your own needs. Overgivers become skilled at identifying others' needs while remaining confused about their own. Philosophy calls this external orientation. When attention is always outward, self-knowledge weakens. Weak self-knowledge makes self-respect fragile. You cannot honor what you cannot name. Overgiving keeps your needs unnamed and unmet. Overgiving also damages self-respect by delaying self-assertion until crisis. Philosophy teaches that late truth is harder to receive. When you finally speak up, it comes out as anger or withdrawal. Others feel confused. You feel ashamed. This shame reinforces silence. The cycle continues. Self-respect requires early, calm assertion. Overgiving prevents that skill from developing. Another layer is the erosion of self-compassion. Philosophy distinguishes compassion from neglect. Overgivers show immense compassion outwardly but little inwardly. You judge yourself harshly for fatigue or frustration. This double standard damages self-respect deeply. You deserve the same understanding you offer others. Until that balance is restored, generosity will remain one-sided. Finally, overgiving destroys self-respect because it teaches you to disappear politely. Philosophy reminds us that disappearing is not humility, it is avoidance of self. Self-respect returns when you stop disappearing, when you choose presence over obligation, when you give without erasing yourself, and when you finally believe that your worth does not need to be proven through sacrifice. Chapter 7. The Hidden Anger That Builds Inside Helpers. Hidden anger does not begin as rage, it begins as silence. Philosophy teaches that anger is not the enemy of kindness, but its neglected companion. Helpers rarely see themselves as angry people. They see themselves as patient, understanding, and accommodating. Yet every time a need is ignored, a boundary crossed, or exhaustion dismissed, something tightens inside. This tightening is anger suppressed for the sake of harmony. It is anger that was never allowed to speak because speaking felt dangerous. Over time, that anger does not vanish. It settles quietly beneath the surface, shaping tone, energy, and perception. Helpers often feel confused by sudden irritability or numbness. They wonder why they feel drained despite doing good. The answer is not ingratitude, it is unexpressed truth demanding attention. The anger inside helpers often comes from repeated self-betrayal. Philosophy teaches that anger arises when values are violated. When you value fairness, rest, or mutual care, but consistently deny them to yourself, anger forms. Each time you say yes while wanting to say no, a small act of violence occurs internally. You override your own voice. That voice remembers. Over time, the accumulation of ignored limits creates pressure. Pressure seeks release. But helpers fear anger because they associate it with cruelty or rejection, so they push it down further. This repression intensifies it. What could have been a clear boundary becomes a deep resentment. Resentment feels heavier, more poisonous, and harder to manage than simple anger. Hidden anger also develops when effort goes unseen. Philosophy reminds us that recognition is not vanity, it is acknowledgement of reality. Helpers invest emotional labor quietly. They listen, support, anticipate, and stabilize without drawing attention to themselves. When this effort is not acknowledged, the psyche feels erased. Erasure breeds anger. But helpers rarely express it because doing so feels selfish. They tell themselves others don't mean to. This rationalization silences the emotion but does not resolve it. Over time, the helper begins to feel invisible. Invisibility wounds deeply. Anger grows not because people failed, but because the helper never allowed the wound to be named. Another source of hidden anger is the imbalance between giving and receiving. Philosophy teaches that balance is a law of life. When balance is broken repeatedly, tension arises. Helpers often give far more than they receive, telling themselves it is fine, but the body keeps score. Each unreciprocated effort leaves a trace. That trace accumulates as bitterness. Bitterness is anger that has lost hope. It no longer seeks correction, it seeks distance. Helpers may withdraw emotionally while continuing to perform their role. This split creates confusion in relationships. Others sense coldness, but do not understand its source. The helper feels guilty for feeling angry, which deepens repression. The cycle tightens. Hidden anger also forms when helpers suppress truth to preserve peace. Philosophy teaches that peace built on silence is fragile. When you avoid honest conversations to prevent discomfort, anger grows in the shadows. Each unspoken truth becomes emotional residue. Over time, these residues harden. The helper feels tense around those they support. Small requests feel heavy. Minor inconveniences trigger disproportionate irritation. This is not because the helper is unkind, but because the emotional debt has grown too large. Suppressed truth demands expression eventually. If not through words, then through mood, distance, or burnout. Another layer of anger comes from unrealistic self-expectations. Helpers often believe they should be endlessly patient, understanding, and available. Philosophy calls this moral perfectionism. When you hold yourself to impossible standards, failure is inevitable. Each moment of fatigue or frustration becomes self-judgment. This judgment turns anger inward. Instead of recognizing the need for rest or change, you criticize yourself for being less kind. Self-directed anger erodes compassion. Over time, you feel harsh toward yourself and subtly toward others. This hardness is not who you are. It is anger turned inward for too long. Hidden anger also develops from being taken for granted. Philosophy explains that expectation replaces appreciation when boundaries are absent. Helpers who never assert limits teach others to assume access. When gratitude fades, anger appears, but helpers hesitate to express it because they fear appearing ungrateful themselves. This irony is painful. You give endlessly and feel guilty for wanting recognition. The anger deepens because it has no acceptable outlet. It remains trapped between obligation and resentment. Another source of anger is the loss of autonomy. Philosophy teaches that freedom is essential to dignity. When helping becomes compulsory rather than chosen, freedom disappears. You feel trapped by your own generosity. Trapped people grow angry. Helpers may feel irritated by requests they once welcomed. They may fantasize about escape or withdrawal. These fantasies are signals of lost agency. But instead of addressing the loss, helpers often double down, believing more giving will restore meaning. It does not. It deepens anger. Hidden anger also comes from emotional exhaustion. Philosophy distinguishes fatigue from burnout. Fatigue recovers with rest. Burnout is the result of prolonged emotional suppression. Helpers suppress anger, frustration, and need for too long. Eventually, emotional numbness sets in. Numbness is anger that has gone quiet. It protects you from feeling too much, but it also blocks joy. Helpers may feel disconnected from those they care for most. This disconnection is often misinterpreted as failure of love. In truth, it is the psyche protecting itself from overload. Another contributor is the helper's fear of being seen as selfish. Philosophy teaches that fear distorts virtue. When you fear judgment more than self-harm, you continue harmful patterns. Each act of self-denial adds fuel to anger. The anger grows not toward others, but toward the self, for allowing the pattern to continue. This self-directed anger deepens shame. Shame silences expression further. The loop becomes self-reinforcing. Hidden anger also arises from unfulfilled expectations of reciprocity. Helpers often believe that kindness will naturally be returned. When it is not, disappointment emerges. Philosophy warns against unspoken contracts. When expectations are unspoken, disappointment feels like betrayal. The helper feels foolish for hoping. Anger follows. Instead of expressing the need for reciprocity, the helper withdraws emotionally. Relationships suffer silently. Another layer of anger comes from loss of identity. Philosophy teaches that a human being is more than one role. Helpers who define themselves solely as supporters lose touch with other parts of themselves. Creativity, ambition, and play are neglected. This neglect breeds frustration. Frustration becomes anger. But the helper does not know what they are angry about. They only know something feels wrong. That wrongness is the self asking to be reclaimed. Hidden anger also surfaces when helpers realize they have enabled dependency. Philosophy teaches that enabling harms both parties. When others rely excessively on your help, resentment grows. You feel burdened. They feel entitled. This dynamic poisons connection. Anger emerges because the helper feels trapped in a role they helped create. Acknowledging this feels shameful, so anger remains unspoken. Finally, the hidden anger inside helpers is not a flaw, it is a message. Philosophy teaches that anger signals the need for change. When listened to, anger becomes clarity. When ignored, it becomes bitterness. Helpers reclaim peace not by becoming less kind, but by becoming more honest. When anger is acknowledged and boundaries are restored, kindness regains its warmth. The anger fades because it is no longer needed to protect what was ignored for too long. Hidden anger continues to grow when helpers begin censoring their own emotional reactions. Philosophy teaches that emotion censored does not disappear, it mutates. When helpers feel irritation and immediately shame themselves for it, the anger loses its healthy outlet. Instead of becoming a signal for change, it becomes a secret. Secrets grow heavier with time. Each moment of forced calm adds pressure beneath the surface. Helpers often pride themselves on emotional control, not realizing that control without expression is suppression. Suppression turns anger inward, where it corrodes self-trust. You begin doubting your reactions, questioning whether your feelings are justified. This self-doubt deepens frustration. Anger now has two layers: anger at others for over-reliance and anger at yourself for feeling angry at all. This internal conflict is exhausting. It drains emotional energy faster than conflict ever could. What feels like patience is actually prolonged self-silencing. Another source of hidden anger is the unequal emotional risk helpers carry. Philosophy reminds us that fairness is not only about action, but about vulnerability. Helpers often make themselves emotionally available while others remain guarded. You listen deeply, hold pain, and stay present in difficult moments, while your own vulnerability remains unshared. Over time, this imbalance creates anger, not because you want attention, but because intimacy has become one-sided. You are exposed while others remain protected. This asymmetry feels unsafe, even if it looks generous. Anger arises as a defense against emotional imbalance, but helpers often misinterpret this anger as ingratitude or bitterness. They suppress it further, deepening the divide between inner truth and outward behavior. Hidden anger also forms when helpers repeatedly abandon their own timing. Philosophy teaches that timing is part of wisdom. When you rush to help before you are ready, you violate your own rhythm. This creates tension. You may feel irritable or drained without understanding why. The anger comes from being pushed past your internal pace. Helpers often ignore timing because urgency feels moral. Someone needs help now, but constant urgency overrides discernment. Discernment protects energy. Without it, Anger accumulates as fatigue. Fatigue hardens into resentment. Resentment poisons generosity silently. The helper still shows up, but the joy is gone. What remains is duty. Another layer of anger appears when helpers realize they are valued more for what they do than for who they are. Philosophy teaches that recognition of being is essential for dignity. When relationships revolve around your service, your presence becomes conditional. This realization hurts. It creates grief first, then anger. But helpers often deny this anger because it threatens the relationship. Instead, they double down, hoping more effort will earn deeper recognition. It rarely does. The anger intensifies because the truth becomes clearer with each unmet expectation. You feel reduced to function. This reduction is dehumanizing, even when wrapped in praise. Hidden anger also grows from chronic emotional postponement. Philosophy describes this as deferred selfhood. Helpers tell themselves they will address their feelings later, after the crisis passes, after everyone is okay. But later never comes. There is always another need, another request, another emergency. The self remains postponed indefinitely. Anger forms because something essential is being denied repeatedly. Denial without acknowledgement creates rage over time. Rage does not always explode. Sometimes it calcifies. It becomes numbness, cynicism, or withdrawal. Helpers may feel disconnected from life without knowing why. That disconnection is anger turned inward for too long. Another source of anger is the loss of choice. Philosophy teaches that freedom is central to psychological health. When helping becomes automatic, choice disappears. You feel compelled to respond, even when exhausted. Compulsion breeds resentment. Resentment breeds anger. Helpers often mistake this anger for moral failure. They believe they should feel grateful for being needed. This belief traps them. Gratitude cannot coexist with coercion. When choice is removed, generosity loses meaning. Anger arises as the psyche's attempt to restore autonomy. Hidden anger also emerges when helpers absorb blame unfairly. Philosophy notes that responsibility assumed without consent becomes burden. Helpers often take responsibility for others' emotions, outcomes, and failures. When things go wrong, they blame themselves. This misplaced responsibility creates anger because it is unjust. But helpers struggle to release it because responsibility feels like control. Letting go feels risky. Anger grows beneath the weight of carrying what was never theirs to hold. Another layer forms when helpers notice others do not grow because of their help. Philosophy teaches that struggle is necessary for development. When helpers rescue repeatedly, they prevent learning. Eventually, frustration appears. You feel stuck supporting the same patterns. This frustration turns into anger, not at the person, but at the cycle. Yet helpers feel guilty for this anger, believing they should be endlessly patient. The anger deepens because it is both justified and forbidden. Hidden anger also develops when helpers feel trapped by their reputation. Philosophy warns that identity prisons form when roles solidify. Once you are known as the one who helps, deviation feels dangerous. You fear disappointing expectations. This fear creates resentment toward the role itself. You begin resenting the very trait you were praised for. This resentment is confusing and painful. You may feel ungrateful or ashamed. But the anger is pointing to an identity that has grown too narrow. Another contributor is the lack of acknowledgement for emotional cost. Philosophy emphasizes that cost must be named to be honored. Helpers often hide their exhaustion to appear strong. Others assume strength equals capacity. Demands increase. Anger grows because the cost remains invisible. Invisible cost feels unfair. Fairness is a core psychological need. When fairness is violated repeatedly, anger is inevitable. Hidden anger also surfaces in moments of withdrawal. Helpers may suddenly pull away, become distant, or fantasize about disappearing. Philosophy sees withdrawal as self-preservation. When expression feels unsafe, the psyche chooses distance. This distance is anger translated into silence. Silence protects, but it also isolates. Relationships strain. The helper feels misunderstood. The anger grows because the original needs remain unmet. Another layer of anger comes from realizing how much life was postponed. Philosophy teaches that time is non-renewable. Helpers may look back and see missed opportunities, neglected dreams, and abandoned desires. This realization can be devastating. Anger arises toward the past self who always chose others. But this anger is not condemnation, it is grief demanding acknowledgement. Until grief is honored, anger remains sharp. Hidden anger also grows when helpers recognize the double standard they live by. They offer compassion freely, but deny it to themselves. Philosophy calls this ethical imbalance. When you treat yourself worse than you treat others, anger forms because injustice is occurring internally. Self-respect cannot survive this disparity. Anger becomes the only voice left to protest. Finally, the hidden anger inside helpers persists until it is allowed to be seen as wisdom. Philosophy teaches that anger, when listened to, restores balance. It points toward boundaries, rest, honesty, and self-reclamation. When helpers stop fearing their anger and start understanding it, transformation begins. Anger softens into clarity. Resentment dissolves into choice, and helping, freed from obligation, becomes an act of strength rather than sacrifice. Chapter 8. Boundaries are not selfish. Boundaries are not selfish because they are an act of honesty, not rejection. Philosophy teaches that clarity is a form of respect, both toward others and toward the self. When you set a boundary, you are not saying, "I don't care about you." You are saying, "I care enough to be truthful." Selfishness hides behind manipulation and avoidance. Boundaries do the opposite. They bring reality into the open. They tell others where you end and where they begin. Without that distinction, relationships blur into confusion. Confusion breeds resentment. Resentment poisons connection. Boundaries prevent this slow decay by giving relationships structure. Structure allows care to flow without distortion. Far from being selfish, boundaries are what make genuine kindness possible without self-destruction. Many people believe boundaries are cruel because they associate love with sacrifice. Philosophy challenges this belief by separating love from self-erasure. Love does not require you to disappear. When boundaries are absent, giving becomes compulsive. Compulsion drains joy. Joyless giving feels heavy to both giver and receiver. Boundaries restore choice. Choice restores dignity. Dignity strengthens presence. When you help from a place of choice, your kindness has weight. Others feel it. They respect it. Boundaries transform generosity from obligation into intention. Intention is what makes care meaningful. Boundaries are often mistaken for walls, but philosophy sees them as bridges with gates. They allow connection while protecting integrity. Without boundaries, access is unlimited, and unlimited access invites misuse. Not because people are bad, but because human psychology adapts to availability. When something is always accessible, it is rarely protected. Boundaries teach others how to engage with you respectfully. They define the terms of connection. This definition creates safety. Safety allows trust to grow. Trust deepens relationships. Boundaries are not barriers to closeness. They are the conditions that allow closeness to last. Another reason boundaries are not selfish is that they prevent resentment. Philosophy teaches that resentment is anger deferred. When you say yes while meaning no, resentment begins forming immediately. Each suppressed boundary adds another layer. Eventually, kindness feels bitter, relationships feel heavy. Boundaries interrupt this process early. They allow small discomfort now to prevent large resentment later. This is not selfishness, it is responsibility. Responsible people address issues when they are manageable. Avoidance feels kind in the moment, but creates greater harm over time. Boundaries also protect your energy, which philosophy recognizes as finite. When energy is depleted, presence disappears. You may still show up physically, but emotionally you are gone. Boundaries ensure that when you give fully. Partial presence is more damaging than absence. Others sense when your energy is forced. Forced energy creates tension. Boundaries remove that tension by aligning action with capacity. This alignment restores authenticity. Authenticity builds respect. Respect deepens connection. Many fear boundaries because they fear rejection. Philosophy teaches that rejection based on honesty is less damaging than acceptance based on self-betrayal. When you abandon yourself to be accepted, the acceptance feels hollow. You know it was earned through silence, not truth. Boundaries risk rejection, but they also reveal who can engage with you authentically. Those who respect your boundaries respect you. Those who resist reveal their dependence on your self-neglect. This clarity, though painful at first, is freeing. It separates genuine connection from conditional reliance. Boundaries are also an act of self-respect. Philosophy insists that how you treat yourself teaches others how to treat you. When you protect your time, rest, and emotional space, you signal value. Value invites care. When you neglect yourself, you signal disposability. Disposability invites disregard. Boundaries correct this signal. They say, "I matter too." This statement does not diminish others. It includes yourself in the circle of care. Inclusion of self is not selfishness. Exclusion of self is imbalance. Another reason boundaries are not selfish is that they encourage growth in others. Philosophy notes that struggle is essential for development. When you always step in, others do not learn resilience. Boundaries allow others to face consequences, build skills, and discover strength. This is not abandonment, it is trust. Trust communicates belief in others' capacity. Belief empowers. Overhelping weakens. Boundaries strengthen both sides of the relationship. Boundaries also bring peace to the inner world. Philosophy teaches that inner conflict arises when actions contradict truth. Boundaries align action with truth. This alignment reduces anxiety, guilt, and resentment. You feel calmer because you are no longer negotiating against yourself. Calm presence is magnetic. Others feel it. Calm people are trusted. Trust builds respect. Respect stabilizes relationships. Boundaries create this chain reaction quietly. Many people label boundaries as selfish because they are uncomfortable with disappointment. Philosophy reminds us that disappointment is part of honest human interaction. Protecting others from all disappointment requires sacrificing truth. That sacrifice is unsustainable. Boundaries allow disappointment to exist without becoming destructive. They allow reality to be acknowledged. Reality is the foundation of mature relationships. Immature relationships depend on illusion. Boundaries dissolve illusion gently but firmly. Boundaries are also essential for identity. Philosophy teaches that identity requires limits. Without limits, the self dissolves into roles and expectations. Boundaries protect the core of who you are. They preserve your values, priorities, and direction. When identity is protected, life feels coherent. Coherence strengthens confidence. Confidence attracts respect. Boundaries are not selfish, they are stabilizing. Another misconception is that boundaries reduce kindness. Philosophy shows the opposite. Boundaries refine kindness. They remove resentment, exhaustion, and obligation from it. What remains is clean care. Clean care feels good to give and good to receive. It does not demand repayment. It does not keep score. It flows freely because it is not draining the giver. Boundaries also teach others to communicate more clearly. When limits are known, people ask instead of assume. Asking creates mutual respect. Assumption creates entitlement. Boundaries eliminate entitlement by replacing it with consent. Consent is the foundation of ethical interaction. Ethics are never selfish. They are the structure of trust. Finally, boundaries are not selfish because they preserve wholeness. Philosophy teaches that a whole person gives better than a fragmented one. When you protect your inner life, you remain present, engaged, and alive. Your kindness becomes sustainable. Your relationships become healthier. Your life becomes yours again. Boundaries do not close the heart. They protect it so it can remain open without breaking. Boundaries continue to reveal their importance when you notice how much emotional noise disappears once they are in place. Philosophy teaches that many inner conflicts are not internal flaws, but external intrusions left unmanaged. When boundaries are absent, your mind becomes crowded with others' expectations, urgencies, and moods. You carry emotional weight that was never yours. This weight creates confusion and fatigue. Once boundaries are set, clarity returns. You begin to hear your own thoughts again. This mental quiet is not isolation, it is order. Order allows intention. Intention restores direction. Direction strengthens self-trust. Boundaries are not selfish because they reduce chaos for everyone involved. They allow relationships to function without constant emotional negotiation. When roles and limits are clear, connection becomes simpler and calmer. Calm is not indifference, it is stability. Stability is what allows care to endure. Boundaries also protect compassion from turning into resentment. Philosophy teaches that compassion must be paired with wisdom. When compassion ignores limits, it burns itself out. Burned-out compassion becomes bitterness. Bitterness damages relationships silently. Boundaries interrupt this process early. They allow compassion to remain fresh. When you know you can say no, your yes becomes sincere. Sincerity strengthens trust. Trust deepens connection. Boundaries are not selfish because they preserve the emotional quality of care. Care offered freely nourishes both sides. Care offered under pressure drains both sides. Boundaries remove pressure by restoring choice. Another overlooked truth is that boundaries teach others how to value you. Philosophy emphasizes that value is not inherent in words, but communicated through behavior. When you treat your time and energy as valuable, others adjust accordingly. When you treat them as endlessly available, others assume they are disposable. Boundaries correct this assumption. They send a clear signal. Your presence is meaningful, not automatic. This signal invites respect. Respect changes dynamics without confrontation. You do not need to demand better treatment. Your boundaries quietly enforce it. This enforcement is not punishment, it is information. Information allows others to respond appropriately. Boundaries are not selfish because they create transparency. Boundaries also reduce emotional guilt. Philosophy teaches that guilt often arises from unclear responsibility. When boundaries are weak, responsibility blurs. You feel responsible for others' happiness, outcomes, and emotions. This burden is impossible to carry. Boundaries clarify what is yours and what is not. Clarification releases guilt. When you know where your responsibility ends, you stop overcompensating. Overcompensation breeds exhaustion. Exhaustion breeds resentment. Boundaries prevent this chain reaction. They are not selfish. They are relieving. They allow everyone to carry their own weight with dignity. Many people fear boundaries because they equate them with distance. Philosophy corrects this misunderstanding by showing that true closeness requires separation. Without separation, there is enmeshment. Enmeshment feels intense but unstable. Boundaries allow two complete individuals to meet rather than merge. This meeting is healthier and more sustainable. When you no longer lose yourself in relationships, you bring your full self to them. Full selves create richer connections. Boundaries are not selfish because they protect individuality, which is essential for genuine intimacy. Boundaries also strengthen communication. Philosophy teaches that clarity is kindness. When boundaries are expressed calmly and early, misunderstandings decrease. You no longer rely on hints, silence, or resentment to communicate needs. Direct communication feels uncomfortable at first, but it prevents long-term harm. Others know where they stand. You know where you stand. This mutual understanding reduces emotional friction. Boundaries are not selfish because they prevent emotional games. Games drain trust. Boundaries build it. Another reason boundaries matter is that they prevent emotional exploitation, intentional or not. Philosophy reminds us that human beings adapt to patterns. When someone learns they can rely on your constant availability, they will, often unconsciously. This reliance can become dependency. Dependency is unhealthy for both sides. Boundaries break dependency by encouraging autonomy. Autonomy strengthens self-respect in others. Boundaries are not selfish because they empower others to grow rather than rely. Boundaries also protect your future self. Philosophy teaches that actions today shape tomorrow's life. When you overextend now, you steal from your future energy, health, and joy. Boundaries preserve resources for growth, creativity, and rest. Preserving resources is not selfish, it is responsible. Responsibility toward your future self is an ethical act. A depleted future helps no one. Boundaries ensure that your life remains sustainable, not just functional. Another important function of boundaries is emotional regulation. Philosophy recognizes that constant emotional exposure overwhelms the nervous system. Boundaries regulate exposure. They allow you to engage without being consumed. This regulation prevents burnout. Burnout destroys empathy, patience, and presence. Boundaries protect these qualities. Protecting empathy is not selfish. It is essential for long-term kindness. Boundaries also restore joy. Philosophy sees joy as alignment with truth. When you live within your limits, life feels lighter. You stop resenting what you once chose. Helping feels meaningful again because it is no longer draining. Boundaries remove the heaviness that comes from obligation. Lightness returns. Lightness invites creativity and warmth. Relationships feel less burdensome and more alive. Boundaries are not selfish because they bring joy back into connection. Many people discover that boundaries reveal who truly respects them. Philosophy teaches that respect shows itself under limitation. When you set a boundary, those who value you adjust. Those who relied on your self-neglect resist. This resistance is information. It clarifies which relationships were built on mutual respect and which were built on convenience. Boundaries are not selfish because they bring truth to light. Truth strengthens life, even when uncomfortable. Boundaries also dismantle the myth of endless capacity. Philosophy reminds us that limitation is human, not failure. Accepting limits restores humility and self-compassion. When you stop pretending to be limitless, You stop punishing yourself for being human. This compassion extends outward naturally. Boundaries are not selfish because they honor humanity rather than deny it. Another benefit is restored self-trust. Philosophy teaches that self-trust grows when actions match inner truth. Boundaries align the two. Each time you honor a limit, you reinforce self-respect. Self-respect strengthens confidence. Confidence stabilizes presence. Presence improves relationships. Boundaries create this upward cycle quietly. Boundaries also allow forgiveness to be genuine. Philosophy notes that forgiveness without boundaries invites repetition of harm. When boundaries exist, forgiveness becomes a choice rather than a survival strategy. Choice restores power. Power grounded in calm feels safe. Boundaries are not selfish because they allow forgiveness without self-erasure. Finally, boundaries are not selfish because they protect life itself. They preserve energy, clarity, dignity, and connection. Without boundaries, kindness collapses under its own weight. With boundaries, kindness becomes sustainable. You do not become colder. You become whole. And from wholeness, care flows naturally, freely, and without resentment. Chapter 9. Learning to say no without guilt. Learning to say no without guilt begins with understanding where guilt comes from. Philosophy teaches that guilt often appears when responsibility is misplaced. Many people feel guilty not because they are doing something wrong, but because they were conditioned to believe others' comfort is their duty. Saying no triggers that conditioning. The body reacts before the mind can reason. Anxiety rises, the heart tightens. Guilt whispers that you are selfish, unkind, or abandoning someone. But this guilt is not moral truth. It is emotional habit. It was learned, not chosen. Recognizing this is the first step toward freedom. When you see guilt as a signal of old conditioning rather than a verdict on your character, its power weakens. You begin to pause instead of panic. In that pause, choice becomes possible. Choice restores dignity. Dignity dissolves guilt. Guilt also comes from confusing empathy with obligation. Philosophy makes a clear distinction between understanding someone's needs and being responsible for them. You can care without carrying. You can understand without complying. When empathy turns into obligation, the self disappears. Saying no feels cruel because you imagine the other person's disappointment as your fault. But disappointment is not harm. It is a natural response to unmet expectations. Protecting others from all disappointment requires sacrificing truth. Truth is heavier to avoid than guilt in the short term, but lighter to live with in the long term. Learning to say no means accepting that discomfort is part of honesty. Guilt fades when honesty becomes familiar. Another source of guilt is fear of rejection. Philosophy recognizes rejection as a core human fear. When belonging once felt conditional, saying no feels like risking exile. The nervous system reacts as if survival is at stake. You say yes to preserve connection. Over time, this habit teaches the body that compliance equals safety. Breaking this association takes patience. Each time you say no and survive, the nervous system learns a new truth. Boundaries do not equal abandonment. Safety can exist without self-erasure. Guilt loosens its grip when experience contradicts fear. Guilt also thrives when identity is tied to being helpful. Philosophy warns that identity built on usefulness is fragile. When you believe your worth depends on giving, saying no feels like betraying who you are. The question becomes, if I don't help, what value do I have? This belief turns boundaries into threats. Learning to say no requires redefining worth. Worth is not proven through availability. It exists independent of effort. When this truth is internalized, guilt loses its foundation. You stop measuring yourself by output and start respecting yourself as a person. Another layer of guilt comes from moral perfectionism. Philosophy teaches that perfectionism distorts ethics. You believe you should always be kind, always understanding, always available. When reality contradicts this ideal, guilt appears. But perfection is not morality. It is fantasy. Real ethics include limits, fatigue, and competing needs. Saying no acknowledges humanity. Guilt fades when you accept that being good does not mean being endless. Goodness includes discernment. Discernment requires refusal sometimes. Refusal does not negate kindness, it refines it. Guilt also persists when boundaries are delayed. Philosophy observes that late boundaries feel harsher than early ones. When you say yes repeatedly and then suddenly say no, guilt intensifies. You feel like you are breaking an unspoken contract. Learning to say no without guilt involves practicing early honesty. Early no's are calmer, they prevent resentment, they feel cleaner. Clean boundaries carry less emotional charge. Guilt diminishes when boundaries are timely and consistent. Another important shift is separating intention from impact. Philosophy teaches that your intention in saying no is self-respect, not harm. The impact may be disappointment, but disappointment is not damage. When you confuse impact with wrongdoing, guilt grows. Learning to tolerate others' emotions without absorbing them is essential. Their feelings belong to them. Your responsibility is to be honest, not to manage their reactions. Guilt fades when responsibility is correctly placed. Guilt also decreases when you stop over-explaining. Philosophy shows that excessive explanation is a form of apology for existing. When you justify your no excessively, you reinforce the belief that it is wrong. A simple, calm no communicates confidence. Confidence reassures the nervous system. Over time, brief honesty feels safer than elaborate defense. Guilt feeds on justification. It starves when clarity is practiced. Another source of guilt is lack of self-compassion. Philosophy teaches that compassion must include the self to remain ethical. When you judge yourself harshly for needing rest or space, guilt intensifies. Treating yourself with the same understanding you offer others reduces internal conflict. Self-compassion normalizes limits. Normalized limits do not produce guilt. They produce balance. Guilt also fades when you experience the benefits of saying no. Philosophy emphasizes learning through lived experience. When you say no and notice increased energy, clarity, and peace, the mind updates its beliefs. You see that refusal did not destroy connection. Often, it improves it. Relationships become lighter. Respect increases. These outcomes weaken guilt's narrative. Reality becomes evidence against fear. Another powerful realization is that saying no protects future yeses. Philosophy teaches sustainability as wisdom. When you say yes to everything, yes loses meaning. When you protect your capacity, yes regains value. Knowing this reframes no as preservation, not denial. Guilt dissolves when no is seen as care for the future. Guilt also decreases as self-trust grows. Philosophy shows that trust is built through consistency. Each honored boundary strengthens trust in yourself. Self-trust reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety weakens guilt. Over time, no becomes natural. It no longer feels dramatic. It feels honest. Learning to say no without guilt also involves grieving an old version of yourself. Philosophy acknowledges grief as part of growth. You may grieve being the one everyone relied on. You may grieve lost approval. Allowing this grief prevents guilt from disguising itself as nostalgia. Growth requires letting go. Guilt often masks resistance to change. Finally, Saying no without guilt is an act of alignment. Philosophy teaches that alignment brings peace. When your actions match your truth, inner conflict dissolves. Guilt fades because there is nothing to argue with inside. You know why you said no, you trust that reason, and in that trust, no becomes not a rejection of others, but an acceptance of yourself. Learning to say no without guilt deepens when you begin noticing how guilt loses power through repetition. Philosophy teaches that fear weakens when it is faced calmly. The first no feels heavy because it challenges years of conditioning. The second no still feels uncomfortable but less threatening. Over time, the emotional charge fades. Guilt relies on novelty and surprise. When no becomes familiar, guilt no longer feels urgent or true. You begin to realize that guilt was never a moral compass, it was a reflex. Each respectful no retrains the nervous system. You learn that nothing collapses when you honor yourself. Life continues. Relationships adjust. This lived experience dismantles guilt more effectively than any intellectual argument. Another layer of guilt dissolves when you stop confusing kindness with compliance. Philosophy teaches that kindness without choice is not kindness, it is submission. Submission breeds resentment, not love. When you say no calmly, you allow kindness to remain honest. You may still care deeply, but you no longer abandon yourself to prove it. This distinction restores integrity. Integrity quiets guilt because your actions align with your values. Values lived consistently create inner peace. Inner peace does not argue with itself. Guilt thrives in inner conflict. Alignment ends that conflict. Guilt also fades when you recognize that adults are responsible for managing disappointment. Philosophy reminds us that maturity includes emotional regulation. When you take responsibility for others' emotions, you infantilize them and burden yourself. Saying no without guilt requires trusting others' resilience. They can feel disappointed and still be okay. Protecting them from discomfort is not kindness, it is control disguised as care. Releasing that control frees you. Guilt fades when you stop assuming responsibility that was never yours. Another important shift occurs when you stop labeling self-care as selfishness. Philosophy distinguishes selfishness from self-preservation. Selfishness exploits others for gain. Self-preservation protects your capacity to live. Saying no to protect energy, health, or clarity is ethical, not indulgent. When you internalize this distinction, guilt loses its moral disguise. You stop arguing with yourself about whether your needs are legitimate. They simply are. Legitimacy does not require justification. Guilt also weakens when you observe how saying no improves communication. Philosophy teaches that honesty simplifies life. When you say no early and clearly, misunderstandings decrease. You no longer carry the burden of hidden resentment. Others know where you stand. Clarity reduces emotional tension. Reduced tension creates safer interactions. Safe interactions do not provoke guilt. Guilt often arises from confusion and mixed signals. Clear no's eliminate that confusion. Another contributor to guilt reduction is the realization that overgiving distorts relationships. Philosophy notes that imbalance creates dependency, not closeness. When you always say yes, relationships become transactional. When you say no appropriately, relationships regain authenticity. Authenticity feels lighter. Lightness dissolves guilt. You begin to experience interactions without internal resistance. Resistance was the true source of guilt, not refusal. Guilt also fades when you stop over-identifying with others' expectations. Philosophy teaches that expectations are projections, not obligations. Not obligations. Others may expect you to be available because you always were. That expectation does not define your duty. Recognizing this separates identity from habit. You are not required to remain who you were, simply because others adjusted to your self-neglect. Growth requires changing patterns. Guilt is often the echo of an old role dissolving. Another powerful realization is that saying no teaches others how to respect you. Philosophy emphasizes that respect is learned through boundaries. When you say no calmly, you communicate self-value. Self-value invites care. Care reduces guilt because interactions feel mutual rather than exploitative. You no longer feel used. Feeling used is a major source of guilt because part of you knows something is wrong. When respect enters the dynamic, guilt exits naturally. Guilt also decreases when you stop narrating your no internally. Philosophy teaches that excessive inner dialogue amplifies emotion. When you replay the no, imagine reactions, and rehearse defense, guilt grows. Practicing simplicity interrupts this cycle. You say no, you move on. The mind follows behavior. When behavior is calm, the mind settles. Guilt starves without mental rehearsal. Another layer of freedom comes when you accept that some people will not like your boundaries. Philosophy teaches acceptance of reality. Not everyone will approve of your growth. That does not make your boundary wrong. Disapproval is not danger. When you stop interpreting disapproval as failure, guilt loses its leverage. You allow others to have their feelings without carrying them. This separation restores emotional balance. Guilt also fades when you recognize the cost of not saying no. Philosophy urges us to examine consequences. The cost of constant yeses is exhaustion, resentment, and self-erasure. When you weigh this cost honestly, no becomes an act of responsibility. Responsibility carries dignity. Dignity does not coexist with guilt. You respect yourself for protecting your life. Another important moment comes when you experience joy returning after saying no. Philosophy sees joy as evidence of alignment. When joy returns, guilt feels irrational. You realize that no made space for aliveness. Aliveness confirms truth. Truth dissolves guilt because there is nothing to apologize for. Guilt also loosens when you stop seeking permission to exist fully. Philosophy teaches that existence does not require approval. You do not need to earn rest, boundaries, or space. They are inherent rights. When you internalize this, no feels natural. Natural actions do not produce guilt. They produce calm. Another realization is that guilt often masks grief. Philosophy acknowledges grief as part of transformation. You grieve the version of yourself who was always available. You grieve lost approval. Allowing that grief prevents guilt from taking its place. Grief passes. Guilt lingers when grief is avoided. Finally, learning to say no without guilt is learning to trust yourself. Philosophy teaches that trust quiets fear. When you trust your judgment, you no longer argue internally. No becomes a clear expression of truth. In that clarity, guilt has nowhere to live. Chapter 10. Helping by choice, not by fear. Helping by choice, not by fear, begins with recognizing the emotional force that has been driving your generosity. Philosophy teaches that fear disguises itself as virtue when it goes unexamined. Fear of rejection, fear of being seen as selfish, fear of losing connection, these fears quietly shape behavior. When fear is in control, helping feels urgent and compulsory. You help not because you want to, but because you feel you must. Choice disappears. Over time, this compulsion drains meaning from kindness. Helping becomes heavy. The first step toward freedom is awareness. When you notice fear behind your yes, you reclaim power. Power does not mean refusing to help. It means deciding when and how to help consciously. Conscious action restores dignity. Dignity transforms generosity into something clean and grounding rather than exhausting. Fear-driven helping often feels rushed. Philosophy notes that fear collapses time. Everything feels immediate and pressing. You respond before checking capacity. You say yes before listening to yourself. Helping by choice slows this process. It introduces pause. Pause allows discernment. Discernment asks simple questions. Do I have the energy? Do I want to do this? Is this mine to carry? These questions are not selfish. They are clarifying. Clarification prevents resentment. When helping is chosen after reflection, it feels lighter. You show up fully instead of partially. Presence replaces obligation. Others feel the difference immediately. Helping by choice also requires separating compassion from anxiety. Philosophy teaches that compassion is steady, while anxiety is frantic. Anxiety wants to fix quickly to relieve discomfort. Compassion can sit with discomfort without rushing to remove it. When fear drives helping, you rush to ease tension, yours and theirs. When choice drives helping, you respect the process. You allow others to feel their emotions without absorbing them. This creates healthier dynamics. People grow when they are supported, not rescued. Choice-based helping supports growth. Fear-based helping prevents it. Another shift occurs when you realize that fear-based helping often seeks control. Philosophy explains that fear craves predictability. By helping excessively, you try to stabilize relationships and outcomes. Choice-based helping releases control. You accept uncertainty. You help where it aligns with your values, not where it promises safety. This acceptance strengthens inner calm. Calm presence is powerful. It communicates confidence. Confidence invites respect. Helping by choice builds respect, not dependency. Helping by choice also restores authenticity. Philosophy values alignment between inner truth and outer action. When fear drives helping, you act against yourself. When choice drives helping, actions match truth. This alignment reduces inner conflict. You no longer feel torn between duty and desire. Peace replaces tension. Peace allows kindness to flow naturally. Others sense sincerity. Sincere help is nourishing. Fear-driven help feels strained. People respond differently to each. Another important aspect is learning to tolerate disappointment. Philosophy teaches that growth requires discomfort. When you stop helping out of fear, some people will feel disappointed. That disappointment is not a failure. It is a sign of changing patterns. Allowing disappointment without collapsing builds resilience. Resilience dissolves fear. Over time, you learn that relationships can survive honesty. This learning is liberating. Helping becomes optional rather than obligatory. Helping by choice also changes your relationship with no. Philosophy teaches that no protects the meaning of yes. When you say no where fear once ruled, your yes gains power. You stop diluting generosity. Each act of help becomes intentional. Intentional acts carry weight. Weight commands respect. Respect stabilizes relationships. Helping by choice strengthens your position without aggression or withdrawal. Another transformation occurs internally. Philosophy emphasizes self-trust as the foundation of freedom. When you help by choice, you trust your judgment. You no longer second-guess every decision. This trust reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety weakens fear's grip. Helping feels calmer. Calm generosity does not deplete. It replenishes. You feel good after helping, not drained. This is a sign that fear is no longer in charge. Helping by choice also dismantles guilt. Philosophy teaches that guilt thrives where coercion exists. When you choose freely, there is nothing to feel guilty about. Even when you say no, Guilt fades because the decision was honest. Honesty is grounding. Grounded decisions do not haunt the mind. You move forward without replaying conversations. Mental peace returns. Another benefit is restored balance. Philosophy teaches that life seeks equilibrium. Fear-driven helping creates imbalance. Choice-based helping restores it. You give when aligned and receive without shame. Reciprocity becomes possible. Relationships feel mutual. Mutuality deepens connection. Connection feels safe rather than demanding. Fear loses relevance in safety. Helping by choice also reshapes identity. Philosophy warns against identities built on sacrifice. When helping is chosen, identity expands beyond the helper role. You reclaim interests, rest, and individuality. Life feels fuller. Fullness reduces fear because meaning is no longer concentrated in one role. You are not afraid of losing usefulness because your worth is diversified. This diversification is healthy. Another subtle change is emotional clarity. Philosophy teaches that fear clouds perception. When fear fades, clarity sharpens. You see which requests align with your values and which do not. You stop overthinking. Decisions become simpler. Simplicity feels freeing. Freedom strengthens presence. Presence attracts respect. Helping by choice also allows kindness to be sustainable. Philosophy values sustainability as wisdom. Unsustainable kindness burns out. Sustainable kindness endures. When you help within your limits, you can continue helping over time. This continuity benefits everyone. Fear-driven helping burns bright and collapses. Choice-driven helping glows steadily. Another shift is how others respond. Philosophy notes that people adjust to new patterns. When you stop helping out of fear, some may resist. Others will respect you more. Resistance is temporary. Respect lasts. Over time, dynamics stabilize at a healthier level. Helping becomes appreciated again because it is no longer guaranteed. Helping by choice also restores joy. Philosophy sees joy as evidence of alignment. When fear no longer drives your actions, joy returns naturally. You feel alive when you help. Aliveness confirms truth. Truth dissolves fear. The cycle reverses. Ultimately, helping by choice, not by fear, is an act of self-respect. Philosophy teaches that self-respect is the soil from which all healthy relationships grow. When you help from choice, you remain whole. From wholeness, generosity becomes a gift, not a sacrifice. Helping by choice continues to mature when you become aware of the subtle emotional signals that guide your decisions. Philosophy teaches that fear speaks loudly and urgently, while choice speaks quietly and steadily. Fear pressures you to act immediately. Choice invites you to listen. When you learn to notice this difference, your relationship with helping changes. You stop reacting to emotional noise and start responding to inner clarity. This clarity feels calm, not dramatic. It does not demand action, it offers direction. Acting from this place restores balance. You no longer feel pulled apart by obligation, you feel grounded in intention. Grounded intention removes regret. Regret is often the aftertaste of fear-driven decisions. When helping is chosen, there is no regret because the action aligns with truth. Alignment is the antidote to exhaustion. Another sign of helping by choice is the absence of inner bargaining. Philosophy observes that fear-based helping is often followed by silent negotiations, hoping for appreciation, relief, or reciprocity. Choice-based helping expects nothing. It gives freely because it wants to, not because it needs something in return. This freedom changes the emotional tone of generosity. You feel open instead of tight. You help without watching reactions. Watching reactions is fear seeking reassurance. When reassurance is no longer needed, generosity becomes clean. Clean generosity strengthens self-respect. Self-respect stabilizes relationships. People sense when help is offered freely. They respond with genuine appreciation rather than expectation. Helping by choice also transforms how you experience responsibility. Philosophy teaches that responsibility chosen feels empowering, while responsibility imposed feels burdensome. When fear drives helping, responsibility feels heavy. You feel responsible for outcomes beyond your control. When choice drives helping, responsibility is limited and clear. You do what is yours to do and release the rest. This release reduces anxiety. Anxiety often fuels overhelping. When anxiety fades, helping becomes proportionate. Proportion protects energy. Protected energy sustains compassion. Compassion without proportion burns out. Another shift occurs when you stop using helping as a way to avoid your own emotions. Philosophy recognizes that fear often pushes us outward. Helping becomes distraction. Choice-based helping allows you to stay present with yourself first. You do not rush to fix others to escape inner discomfort. You acknowledge your own feelings before offering support. This self-awareness changes the quality of your help. It becomes attuned rather than reactive. Attuned help respects both parties. It does not rescue. It accompanies. Accompaniment feels supportive without being invasive. This balance strengthens trust. Helping by choice also changes your relationship with time. Philosophy teaches that fear collapses time while wisdom expands it. When you help by choice, you respect timing. You do not rush into commitments that will drain you later. You consider the long view. This long view prevents burnout. Burnout is often the result of ignoring future cost. Choice accounts for cost. Accounting for cost is not selfish, it is realistic. Realism sustains generosity. Sustainable generosity benefits everyone. Another important development is emotional neutrality. Philosophy explains that fear-driven helping is emotionally charged. You feel anxious, guilty, or tense. Choice-based helping feels emotionally neutral. You care, but you are not entangled. Entanglement drains energy. Neutrality preserves it. Preserved energy allows you to be present longer. Presence is more valuable than overextension. People feel presence more deeply than effort. Helping by choice prioritizes presence over performance. Helping by choice also reveals hidden motivations. Philosophy teaches that awareness dissolves illusion. When you pause before helping, you may notice motives like wanting to be liked, feared, or needed. Seeing these motives without judgment is liberating. Once seen, they lose power. You can choose again from a cleaner place. This honesty with yourself builds integrity. Integrity strengthens self-trust. Self-trust weakens fear. The cycle shifts from compulsion to freedom. Another change is how you handle requests. Philosophy notes that fear hears every request as a demand. Choice hears requests as information. Information can be evaluated. You ask, is this aligned? Do I have capacity? Is this appropriate? These questions are not barriers. They are filters. Filters protect quality. Quality matters more than quantity. Helping by choice prioritizes quality of support over volume of sacrifice. Helping by choice also reduces emotional resentment. Philosophy teaches that resentment forms when action contradicts desire. When helping aligns with desire, resentment has no soil to grow in. You may still feel tired but not bitter. Tiredness passes. Bitterness lingers. Choice prevents bitterness. This prevention is a gift to yourself and others. Bitter helpers harm relationships unintentionally. Chosen helpers strengthen them. Another shift is increased respect from others. Philosophy reminds us that respect follows self-respect. When you help by choice, you set boundaries naturally. Others sense your autonomy. Autonomy invites respect. Respect changes how people ask for help. They become more considerate. They ask instead of assume. This shift feels relieving. Helping becomes collaborative rather than extractive. Helping by choice also restores personal growth. Philosophy teaches that growth requires space. Fear-driven helping consumes space. Choice-based helping preserves it. You reclaim time for learning, creativity, and rest. These activities replenish the self. A replenished self gives better. This cycle is self-sustaining. Fear-driven cycles are self-destructive. Another important realization is that helping by choice models healthy behavior. Philosophy sees modeling as powerful teaching. When you help without fear, others learn to do the same. You demonstrate that care does not require self-erasure. This example influences relationships quietly. Health spreads through modeling more than instruction. Helping by choice also reshapes compassion. Philosophy teaches that compassion rooted in freedom is gentler and more enduring. You no longer carry others' pain as your own. You stand beside it. Standing beside preserves strength. Strength allows compassion to remain warm rather than heavy. Another subtle benefit is mental peace. Philosophy notes that fear creates mental noise. Choice creates quiet. Quiet allows reflection. Reflection deepens wisdom. Wisdom guides future helping. The cycle becomes upward rather than draining. Finally, helping by choice becomes an expression of wholeness. Philosophy teaches that wholeness does not fear loss. When you are whole, you help because you want to share, not because you need to secure connection. In this state, generosity becomes joyful. Joy confirms alignment. Alignment dissolves fear. And helping returns to its rightful place. A gift freely given, not a debt quietly paid. Chapter 11. Reclaiming your time, energy, and identity. Reclaiming your time begins with realizing how quietly it was taken. Philosophy teaches that time is rarely stolen through force. It is surrendered through habit. Each small yes given without reflection, each interruption accepted without resistance, each moment postponed for later slowly shapes a life that is no longer yours. Time disappears not in dramatic losses, but in invisible leaks. When you finally notice, exhaustion has already settled in. Reclaiming time is not about doing less for others. It is about doing more for what matters. It begins with awareness. Awareness slows impulse. Slowing impulse restores choice. Choice returns ownership. Ownership is the first step back to yourself. Energy is reclaimed when you stop treating depletion as a virtue. Philosophy rejects the glorification of exhaustion. Energy is not infinite, and pretending otherwise creates quiet harm. When you constantly override fatigue, you teach your body that its signals are irrelevant. Over time, motivation fades, joy dulls, and resentment grows. Reclaiming energy requires honoring limits without guilt. Rest becomes intentional rather than accidental. You stop waiting to collapse before pausing. This shift feels uncomfortable at first because stillness exposes how tired you truly are. But in that honesty, energy slowly returns. Energy protected becomes energy renewed. Identity is often the last thing to be reclaimed because it was the first thing sacrificed. Philosophy teaches that identity erodes when roles replace being. When you become known only as the helper, supporter, or reliable one, other parts of you go dormant. Dreams, curiosities, and preferences are postponed indefinitely. Over time, you forget what you enjoy outside of usefulness. Reclaiming identity requires asking questions you avoided. What do I want? What excites me? What matters now? These questions feel unfamiliar because they were silenced for so long. Answering them restores self-authorship. Self-authorship brings life back into focus. Reclaiming time also means redefining urgency. Philosophy shows that urgency is often emotional, not real. Many demands feel immediate because others project anxiety. When you absorb that anxiety, you mistake it for obligation. Reclaiming time requires discernment. Not every request deserves immediate action. Pausing before responding creates space. In that space, clarity emerges. You begin choosing what deserves your attention. Attention shapes life. When attention is reclaimed, life becomes intentional again. Energy is also reclaimed by releasing emotional labor that was never yours to carry. Philosophy teaches that responsibility assumed without consent becomes burden. When you stop managing others' emotions, moods, and outcomes, emotional energy returns. This release feels unsettling at first. You may worry that others will struggle without your support, but struggle is not failure, it is growth. By stepping back, you conserve energy and allow others to develop resilience. Energy preserved in this way feels lighter and cleaner. Identity is reclaimed when you stop performing goodness and start living truth. Philosophy distinguishes virtue from performance. Performance depends on audience. Truth depends on alignment. When your actions align with your values rather than expectations, identity stabilizes. You no longer need to monitor reactions constantly. This relief frees mental space. Mental space allows creativity and curiosity to return. Identity expands beyond one role. You become multifaceted again. This expansion feels like returning home. Reclaiming time often requires disappointing people. Philosophy acknowledges disappointment as a natural consequence of change. When you stop being endlessly available, others must adjust. Some will resist. This resistance can trigger guilt, but guilt fades when you see the outcome: more presence, more energy, more clarity. Reclaimed time allows you to invest deeply rather than broadly. Depth brings fulfillment. Fulfillment confirms the decision was right. Energy also returns when you simplify commitments. Philosophy values simplicity as wisdom. Overcommitment scatters energy. Simplification concentrates it. When you reduce unnecessary obligations, your nervous system calms. Calm restores vitality. You feel less rushed, less reactive. Energy begins to flow naturally again. This vitality changes how you show up. You are more present, more patient, more alive. Energy reclaimed transforms relationships quietly. Identity strengthens when you reconnect with solitude. Philosophy teaches that solitude is where self-knowledge grows. When you are always available, you rarely meet yourself. Reclaiming identity requires time alone without purpose or productivity. In that space, forgotten desires resurface. Preferences clarify. You remember who you were before being needed defined you. This remembrance is powerful. It restores continuity to your life story. Reclaiming time also means honoring your rhythms. Philosophy recognizes rhythm as natural order. When you ignore your rhythms to meet constant demand, life feels chaotic. Honoring rhythm means knowing when to engage and when to withdraw. This balance restores harmony. Harmony reduces stress. Reduced stress frees time and energy simultaneously. Life feels less forced and more fluid. Energy is further reclaimed through saying no without explanation. Philosophy teaches that excessive explanation drains power. When you justify every boundary, you reopen negotiation. Reclaiming energy means trusting your decisions. Trust shortens conversations. Shorter conversations conserve energy. Conservation allows restoration. This cycle builds momentum. energy returns faster than expected. Identity also re-emerges through creative expression. Philosophy sees creativity as self-communication. When life revolves around service, creativity is neglected. Reclaiming identity involves making space for expression without outcome. Writing, movement, exploration, these acts reconnect you with your inner world. Expression affirms existence beyond usefulness. This affirmation strengthens self-worth. Reclaiming time, energy, and identity requires patience. Philosophy reminds us that erosion happened gradually, restoration will too. You may feel lost at first. That feeling is not failure. It is transition. Transition is uncomfortable because the old self is dissolving and the new one is forming. Trust this process. Growth feels uncertain before it feels right. As time becomes yours again, energy steadies. As energy steadies, identity clarifies. These elements reinforce each other. Philosophy teaches that wholeness emerges when life is lived from alignment rather than obligation. Reclaiming these aspects is not abandonment of others, it is return to self. From that return, everything you offer becomes cleaner, stronger, and more sustainable. Ultimately, reclaiming your time, energy, and identity is an act of respect for your own life. Philosophy teaches that a respected life does not beg for meaning, it lives it. When you reclaim what was given away unconsciously, you stop disappearing, you stand fully present in your own existence. And from that presence, you can give again not because you must, but because you choose to. Reclaiming your time deepens when you begin to recognize how often urgency was inherited rather than chosen. Philosophy teaches that much of what feels pressing is emotional transfer. Others' anxiety becomes your responsibility when boundaries are absent. You rush because they rush. You respond because they expect it. Over time, this borrowed urgency shapes your days. Reclaiming time requires returning urgency to its owner. Not everything needs your immediate response. When you slow down deliberately, you disrupt the cycle. Slowing down does not make you irresponsible, it makes you discerning. Discernment protects time. Protected time allows thought. Thought restores intention. Intention transforms how life is lived. Time reclaimed this way feels expansive, even if the number of hours remains the same. You experience depth instead of fragmentation. Depth gives life meaning. Energy is further reclaimed when you stop living in a state of emotional readiness. Philosophy describes readiness without rest as a form of vigilance. Helpers often remain on alert, waiting for the next request. This constant readiness drains energy even when nothing is happening. Reclaiming energy means allowing yourself to be unavailable sometimes. Unavailability is not neglect, it is recovery. Recovery allows the nervous system to settle. When the nervous system settles, energy returns naturally. You stop feeling constantly tense. This relaxation restores presence. Presence feels nourishing rather than draining. Energy reclaimed through rest feels different from energy gained through motivation. It feels sustainable. Identity also strengthens when you stop defining yourself by reaction. Philosophy teaches that reaction obscures authorship. When your identity is shaped by what others need, you lose the sense of directing your own life. Reclaiming identity means shifting from reactive living to intentional living. You begin asking, "What am I choosing?" rather than "What is required of me?" This shift is subtle but profound. Choice returns agency. Agency restores confidence. Confidence clarifies identity. You begin to recognize yourself again, not as a role, but as a person with preferences, limits, and direction. Reclaiming time also involves letting go of unnecessary explanations. Philosophy emphasizes that explanation often hides insecurity. When you over-explain your boundaries, you give others power to debate them. Reclaiming time means trusting your decisions enough to state them simply. Simple statements end conversations quickly. This efficiency protects time and energy. Over time, others learn to respect clarity. Clarity reduces negotiation. Reduced negotiation returns time to you. Energy is also reclaimed when you stop carrying unresolved emotional weight. Philosophy teaches that unexpressed emotion drains vitality. When you begin naming feelings honestly, fatigue, frustration, disappointment, emotional energy releases. You no longer hold tension internally. This release feels like relief. Relief creates space. Space allows renewal. Renewed energy feels calmer and more stable. You are no longer driven by adrenaline or guilt. You move at a sustainable pace. Sustainability changes everything. Identity re-emerges when you allow yourself to change. Philosophy warns that clinging to old roles restricts growth. You may feel loyalty to the version of yourself who was always available. Letting go of that identity feels like betrayal. But growth requires shedding outdated definitions. When you allow yourself to evolve, identity expands. Expansion feels uncomfortable at first because it challenges familiarity. But familiarity is not truth. Truth emerges when you align with who you are becoming, not who you were expected to be. Reclaiming time often requires grieving lost opportunities. Philosophy acknowledges grief as a companion to change. You may grieve years spent prioritizing others over yourself. This grief is not regret. It is recognition. Recognition allows closure. Closure frees attention. Freed attention returns to the present. Present, focused living feels lighter. Time stops feeling stolen and starts feeling inhabited. Energy also returns when you stop multitasking emotionally. Philosophy teaches that divided attention drains vitality. When you try to be present for everyone simultaneously, no one receives your full presence, including yourself. Reclaiming energy means focusing on one thing at a time. Single tasking calms the mind. Calm restores energy. Energy flows where attention is undivided. This focus improves quality of engagement. Quality reduces quantity. Less quantity preserves energy. Identity strengthens when you reconnect with values rather than expectations. Philosophy teaches that expectations shift, but values endure. When you live according to expectations, identity fragments. When you live according to values, identity coheres. Reclaiming identity means asking which actions reflect your values, not others' demands. Acting from values feels grounding. Grounding stabilizes self-concept. Stability invites confidence. Confidence reinforces identity. Reclaiming time also involves redefining productivity. Philosophy challenges the idea that busyness equals worth. When you stop equating productivity with value, time opens up. You allow moments of stillness without guilt. Stillness is not wasted time, it is integration. Integration strengthens clarity. Clarity improves decisions. Better decisions protect time. The cycle becomes self-supporting. Energy is reclaimed when you stop ignoring joy. Philosophy views joy as a compass. When joy disappears, something is misaligned. Overgiving often suppresses joy. Reclaiming energy means intentionally making space for what brings aliveness. Aliveness replenishes energy more effectively than rest alone. When joy returns, energy follows. This return feels like revival, not motivation. Identity also reclaims strength through consistency. Philosophy teaches that identity solidifies through repeated, aligned actions. Each time you honor a boundary, rest when needed, or choose yourself without guilt, identity strengthens. These small acts accumulate. Over time, you recognize yourself as someone who respects their own life. This recognition is empowering. Reclaiming time, energy, and identity also means releasing the need to be indispensable. Philosophy teaches that indispensability traps the self. When you allow others to function without you, space opens. In that space, you rediscover your own life. Others adjust. Life continues. This realization is liberating. Energy further returns when you forgive yourself for past self-neglect. Philosophy reminds us that blame drains energy. Forgiveness releases it. You were doing the best you could with what you knew. Compassion toward your past self restores wholeness. Wholeness stabilizes energy. Finally, reclaiming time, energy, and identity is not a single decision, but a daily practice. Philosophy teaches that practice shapes being. Each day you choose alignment over obligation, you step further into your own life. Over time, the sense of loss is replaced by presence. Presence becomes home. Chapter 12. Becoming strong without losing compassion. Becoming strong without losing compassion begins with redefining what strength truly is. Philosophy teaches that strength is not hardness, dominance, or emotional withdrawal. True strength is stability of self. It is the ability to remain grounded in your values while facing pressure, expectation, and discomfort. Compassion does not weaken strength, it tests it. Weakness avoids feeling. Strength allows feeling without collapse. When you become stronger internally, you do not need to close your heart to protect yourself. You learn to stand firmly while staying open. This balance is rare because it requires self-knowledge. Without self-knowledge, compassion turns into self-sacrifice. With self-knowledge, compassion becomes conscious. Conscious compassion does not drain. It flows with intention. Strength built this way feels calm, not aggressive. Calm strength invites trust rather than fear. Many people believe that to become strong they must become colder. Philosophy rejects this false trade. Coldness is not strength, it is armor. Armor protects but also isolates. True strength does not require isolation. It requires boundaries. Boundaries allow compassion to remain clean. When you protect your limits, you can stay emotionally available without being consumed. This availability feels warm rather than heavy. Others feel supported without feeling dependent. You remain present without losing yourself. Strength without compassion becomes cruelty. Compassion without strength becomes collapse. Balance creates integrity. Integrity is the quiet power people respect instinctively. Strength grows when you stop confusing endurance with virtue. Philosophy teaches that suffering without purpose does not build character, it erodes it. Compassionate people often endure more than they should, believing patience is proof of goodness, but endurance without discernment leads to burnout. Burnout hardens the heart. Strength that preserves compassion requires knowing when to step back. Stepping back is not abandonment, it is wisdom. When you rest, reflect, and recover, your compassion renews. Renewed compassion is deeper and steadier. Strength here is restraint, not force. Restraint protects the heart. Another essential shift is learning to say no without withdrawing care. Philosophy teaches that refusal and rejection are not the same. You can say no to a request while still caring about the person. This distinction allows strength and compassion to coexist. When your no is calm and honest, it does not wound. It clarifies. Clarity prevents resentment. Resentment destroys compassion. Strength that communicates clearly preserves emotional connection. People may feel disappointed, but they do not feel attacked. Over time, relationships become healthier. Compassion survives because it is not burdened by obligation. Becoming strong without losing compassion also means regulating empathy. Philosophy warns that unchecked empathy becomes absorption. Absorption drains strength. Strengthened empathy remains aware without merging. You feel with others, not for them. This distinction protects your energy. You remain emotionally responsive without taking responsibility for others' pain. This allows compassion to remain warm rather than overwhelming. Strong compassion does not rush to fix. It listens, supports, and trusts others' capacity to grow. This trust is a form of respect. Respect deepens compassion rather than diminishing it. Strength also grows through self-respect. Philosophy teaches that self-respect is the foundation of ethical action. When you respect yourself, your compassion becomes discerning. You do not offer help that harms you. You do not tolerate behavior that erodes dignity. This discernment protects relationships. Compassion without self-respect invites misuse. Strength without compassion invites fear. Self-respect harmonizes the two. It allows you to care without compromising yourself. Others sense this balance. They feel safe, but not entitled. This dynamic sustains compassion long-term. Another way strength preserves compassion is through emotional honesty. Philosophy teaches that suppressed emotion poisons the heart. When you acknowledge anger, fatigue, or frustration early, they do not harden into bitterness. Bitterness kills compassion. Strength includes the courage to face uncomfortable emotions. Facing them prevents emotional buildup. This keeps the heart open. Open hearts require strong foundations, otherwise they collapse. Emotional honesty strengthens that foundation. Becoming strong without losing compassion also means releasing the need to rescue. Philosophy distinguishes support from rescue. Rescue disempowers both parties. Support empowers. Strength recognizes when to step back and allow others to struggle. Struggle is not harm, it is growth. Allowing growth requires trust. Trust is compassionate. When you stop rescuing, compassion becomes respectful rather than controlling. Respect strengthens relationships. Strength rooted in respect never needs to dominate. Strength also involves consistency. Philosophy teaches that compassion expressed inconsistently confuses others. When your care fluctuates with mood or exhaustion, relationships feel unstable. Consistent boundaries stabilize compassion. Stability allows trust to deepen. Trust makes compassion safer to receive. Strength here is reliability, not intensity. Intensity burns out. Reliability endures. Another transformation occurs when you stop measuring strength by silence. Philosophy teaches that silence is powerful only when chosen. Forced silence breeds resentment. Strength allows voice. You speak when something matters. You address issues early. This prevents emotional buildup. Compassion survives because it is not buried under unspoken truth. Truth strengthens compassion by keeping it honest. Becoming strong without losing compassion also requires patience with yourself. Philosophy reminds us that growth is gradual. You may overcorrect at first, swinging between rigidity and softness. This is part of learning balance. Compassion toward yourself during this process prevents self-judgment. Self-judgment weakens strength. Self-compassion strengthens it. When you treat yourself gently, you model how to treat others firmly, yet kindly. Strength also grows when you detach compassion from approval. Philosophy teaches that compassion given for approval is fragile. When approval disappears, compassion collapses. Compassion rooted in values endures. Strength comes from acting according to principle, not reaction. When your compassion is value-driven, it remains steady even when unappreciated. This steadiness feels powerful. It is not loud. It does not seek recognition. It simply exists. Another important aspect is redefining vulnerability. Philosophy teaches that vulnerability is not exposure without protection. It is openness with boundaries. Strength allows vulnerability without collapse. You share honestly without oversharing. You connect without dissolving. This balanced vulnerability keeps compassion alive without draining strength. Becoming strong without losing compassion also means accepting limits without shame. Philosophy teaches that limits are human. When you accept them, you stop punishing yourself for being finite. Punishment hardens the heart. Acceptance softens it. Strength built on acceptance feels humane. Compassion flourishes in humane strength. Finally, becoming strong without losing compassion is about integration. Philosophy teaches that wholeness arises when opposites are reconciled. Strength and compassion are not enemies. They complete each other. Strength protects compassion. Compassion humanizes strength. When integrated, you become someone who can care deeply without disappearing. Someone who can stand firmly without closing the heart. This is not weakness, it is maturity. Becoming strong without losing compassion continues when you learn to hold emotional weight without letting it bend your spine. Philosophy teaches that strength is the ability to carry reality without distortion. Compassion exposes you to pain, stories, and struggles, but strength determines how you hold them. Weak strength collapses under emotional weight. Rigid strength rejects it entirely. Balanced strength holds pain gently, without absorbing it. This balance allows compassion to remain alive without turning into exhaustion. You listen fully, but you do not internalize everything. You care, but you do not confuse caring with carrying. Over time, this posture becomes natural. Your nervous system relaxes because it is no longer overloaded. Compassion flows through you rather than into you. This distinction preserves energy and clarity. It allows you to remain present without becoming heavy. Presence without heaviness is the mark of mature strength. Another dimension of strength is emotional steadiness. Philosophy teaches that compassion expressed through instability creates confusion. When your emotional responses fluctuate wildly, others feel unsure how to approach you. Strength brings emotional consistency. Consistency does not mean suppressing feeling, it means regulating it. Regulated emotion allows compassion to be expressed calmly, even in difficult situations. Calm compassion reassures others. It creates safety rather than intensity. Intensity may feel caring, but it often overwhelms. Strength moderates intensity, so compassion remains accessible. Over time, people trust your presence because it feels stable. Stability allows deeper connection. Deeper connection does not require emotional sacrifice when strength is present. Becoming strong without losing compassion also means learning when silence serves and when it harms. Philosophy teaches that silence can either protect or imprison. Compassionate people often stay silent to avoid conflict. But prolonged silence erodes strength. Strength knows when to speak. Speaking truth does not eliminate compassion, it preserves it. Unspoken truth turns into resentment. Resentment hardens the heart. When you speak early and clearly, compassion stays clean. Clean compassion does not carry bitterness. Strength here is courage, not confrontation. Courage expressed calmly strengthens relationships rather than damaging them. Strength also grows when you stop personalizing others' pain. Philosophy explains that empathy does not require ownership. When you take others' suffering personally, you weaken yourself and them. You weaken yourself through emotional overload. You weaken them by removing their agency. Strong compassion acknowledges pain without claiming responsibility for it. This allows others to process their experiences without dependence. You remain supportive without becoming essential. This balance preserves dignity on both sides. Strength built on dignity never needs to withdraw compassion. Another essential shift is learning to disappoint without self-betrayal. Philosophy teaches that disappointment is inevitable in honest living. Compassionate people often fear disappointment more than self-harm. Strength reverses this priority. You allow disappointment to exist rather than sacrificing truth to avoid it. This does not mean becoming careless. It means valuing alignment over approval. Compassion survives because it is no longer strained by fear. Fear contaminates kindness. Strength removes fear from the equation. What remains is clear, grounded care. Becoming strong without losing compassion also requires releasing the savior identity. Philosophy warns that saviorhood hides ego behind generosity. When you believe others need you to survive, compassion becomes control. Strength recognizes limits. You are not here to save, you are here to support when aligned. Releasing saviorhood reduces emotional burden. It also restores humility. Humility deepens compassion. Strength grounded in humility does not inflate or collapse. It stands quietly. Strength also involves patience with process. Philosophy teaches that growth unfolds at its own pace. Compassion often rushes growth, trying to ease discomfort quickly. Strength allows discomfort to exist without interference. This restraint honors the process. People grow when allowed to struggle within safe limits. Strength provides safety. Compassion provides warmth. Together, they create an environment for real change. Without strength, compassion interferes. Without compassion, strength intimidates. Balance heals. Another layer of strength is emotional discernment. Philosophy teaches that not all pain requires response. Some pain needs space. Compassion without discernment overwhelms. Strength discerns when to engage and when to step back. Stepping back is not indifference, it is respect. Respect allows others to encounter themselves. This encounter is often necessary for transformation. Strong compassion trusts this truth. Trust reduces urgency. Reduced urgency preserves energy. Becoming strong without losing compassion also means forgiving without enabling. Philosophy distinguishes forgiveness from tolerance of harm. Forgiveness releases bitterness. Enabling repeats damage. Strength allows forgiveness while maintaining boundaries. Boundaries protect compassion from being exploited. Exploited compassion becomes resentful. Resentment poisons relationships. Strength prevents this outcome by holding firm lines without hostility. Calm firmness preserves warmth. Strength grows through embodied presence. Philosophy teaches that presence communicates more than words. When you are grounded in your body, compassion feels safe. Nervous systems respond to calm regulation. Your steadiness helps others regulate themselves. This is quiet leadership. You do not fix or advise constantly. Your presence itself supports. Strength expressed this way is subtle but powerful. It does not drain you because it requires no overextension. Another aspect is redefining kindness. Philosophy teaches that kindness is not agreement. Kindness is respect. You can disagree while remaining kind. You can refuse while remaining compassionate. Strength allows this nuance. Without strength, kindness becomes compliance. Compliance erodes respect. Respect preserves compassion. This cycle reinforces itself over time. Becoming strong without losing compassion also requires integration of shadow emotions. Philosophy teaches that denying anger weakens compassion. Anger acknowledged early protects the heart. When you allow yourself to feel frustration without judgment, it does not harden. It informs boundaries. Boundaries protect compassion. Strength includes emotional literacy. Literacy prevents emotional overflow. Strength also grows when you stop performing empathy. Philosophy warns that performative compassion drains authenticity. When you act compassionate to meet expectations, you disconnect from truth. Strength allows authenticity even when it looks less dramatic. Authentic compassion is quieter. It listens more than it displays. Quiet compassion endures. Another important realization is that compassion does not require proximity. Philosophy teaches that distance can be compassionate. Stepping away from harmful dynamics protects everyone involved. Strength allows distance without hatred. Hatred closes the heart. Distance with clarity keeps it open. This distinction preserves compassion while preventing damage. Finally, becoming strong without losing compassion is a lifelong practice. Philosophy teaches that balance is not static. You will adjust, recalibrate, and learn continuously. Each experience refines your understanding. Over time, strength and compassion stop feeling like opposites. They merge into a steady way of being. You become someone who can care deeply without breaking, stand firmly without closing, and live fully without losing yourself. In the end, helping others is not the problem, losing yourself in the process is. When you give without limits, you teach people that your time, your energy, and your needs come last. And over time, that lesson becomes your reality, not because people are cruel, but because boundaries were never set. True strength is not found in endless sacrifice. It is found in self-respect. When you learn to help by choice instead of fear, your kindness gains weight, your presence gains value, and your relationships become healthier, not heavier. You don't need to stop caring. You need to start caring for yourself with the same seriousness you give to others. Because the moment you protect your energy, you don't become less kind, you become whole.